To AP Human Geography, Chapter 1, Key Issue 1, where we look at how do geographers describe where things are. I'm your host, Andrew Patterson. So in Key Issue 1, we start off at the very beginning with the basics. Maps. Maps. Why are they so important? Well, these are the way we learn where things are and show how to get to other places. As geographers, we look at things spatially, meaning how things are connected to each other based on their position on the Earth. So geography, it's invented by the Greek scholar Eratosthenes. Geo, meaning of the Earth. Graphy, meaning to write or record or describe. So human geographers, which is what we are, ask, where are people and activities found on the Earth? And why are they found there? I can tell you that I love this course because it asks the questions why. Like so many other courses are wonderful in classes and content material, but they kind of tell us how to do things. Geography is awesome for analyzing why. And in geography, we get to look at why people interact with each other the way they do, how they build their societies, and where they are on the Earth based on the physical landscape. I love geography, and I'm glad you are taking a look at this course. So map is geography's most important tool for thinking spatially because we see how things are connected and where they are located to each other. Cartography, keep in mind, this is the science of map making. So geography is not map making. We're studying or memorizing maps and states and countries. Cartography makes maps. Geography is the study of how people are interrelated with the environment. Human geography is. Map scale. When we talk about scale, we're talking about the relationship of a feature's size on a map to its actual size on Earth. So when we scale something, we describe, okay, well, what portion of the Earth are we looking at? And this can be presented in a couple of different ways. In a ratio or fraction, we're looking at perhaps like 1 to 24,000 or 1 to 24,000th. In written scale, maybe we're thinking that 1 inch equals 1 mile, or we can use the bar line like we see down here in this map, where it just straight up shows us the representation of distance. So when we look at scale, we look at this Houston metro area where we are at 1 to 1 million of the scale, and we see pretty much all of Houston. You can see the streets going around here. But when we zoom in, we're looking at a scale of 1 to 10,000, meaning we're seeing a smaller area represented on this map, but we are scaled way in. Okay, so you can see that here's the bar meter right there, and we're actually looking at Houston. What do they have? The old Astrodome? Or I don't even know what that is, to be honest. Projection. So we have a globe Earth floating around out in space. The issue is, if we want to represent that globe or that round spherical object on a flat map so we can take a look at it, it becomes difficult. And with any projection, we're going to have distortion because we can't represent a flat map transition from the round spherical globe. So projection is transferring the spherical globe to a flat map. The problem is we're going to get these distortions as we flatten it out. We're going to get distortions in shape, distance, size, and direction. Excuse me. Most of the projections we end up using are equal area projections, meaning the relative sizes of land masses stay pretty much the same. They try to do the best job they can with that. The different brands or the different kinds of projections that are most common that we'll be looking at is the Mercator, where you have little distortion in the land masses, but the sizes at the poles are grossly distorted. And you think about it, if it's a spherical Earth that we live on, when you distort it way out and spread it on a flat map, Antarctica becomes huge. So that becomes an issue. When you look at Greenland, this is up at the pole, which is much smaller than this. So when you spread it out, it becomes huge. Greenland is not this big. Antarctica is not that big. But what's good about the Mercator projection is most of the continents are apparently the size that they are in real life on the Earth. The good projection over here. This is cool because it seems to preserve the land masses as they are. But the problem is, in order to spread it out flat, there's going to be these interruptions. So obviously, you're not going to travel and skip across this space here. When you put it back together as a globe, you're able to connect here from here. But this is just the choices that we have, and we're trying to preserve certain aspects and limit distortions from what's important for us. We're seeing the Robinson projection is good across the oceans, but the land masses appear smaller. So if we wanted to use ocean travel, this would be great for knowing the distances between like South America and Africa, but our land masses are much smaller. And Africa, honestly, is so much bigger than this on the actual Earth, and it's just not presented that way in the Robinson projection. Okay, so our geographic grid, we're looking at our spherical Earth here, and we have lines of longitude and latitude that help us know where we are and where we're wanting to go based on positions on this grid. To know specifically what we're talking about, we have to know the makeup of this grid. So a meridian, this is an arc drawn between the north and the south pole. These are lines of longitude that go up and down. One of the most important ones to remember is the prime meridian, which is located at 0 degrees longitude at Greenwich, England. I'm off today, I apologize. This is the first video and I'm off. It's Greenwich, England, sorry. So if this is our prime meridian over here at 0, we're going to base everything off of that number. Now, the interesting reason why that is the prime meridian and at 0 is that in the time when this grid was created, Greenwich, England is the center of power there. So of course, they're going to use their home base as 0 or the measurement for the grid across the globe. Then we also have parallels, circles around the globes that are parallel to the equator. Well, if this is our equator down here, then we have all these parallels running latitude-wise parallel to the equator. Equator, of course, is at 0 degrees latitude. The North Pole is at 90 degrees north latitude, and the South Pole is way down here at 90 degrees south latitude. And how we use the grid, for example, is if we're looking for Denver, Colorado, which is about over here, we're going to look for 40 degrees north latitude, so we're going to come up from the equator. It's going to be about 40 degrees north, look at that. And we're going to go 104 degrees west longitude. So we're going to go all the way around and we come over to 104 degrees west longitude. So we're right there near Denver. To get more precise and divide it into degrees, which are minutes and seconds, Denver is actually 39 degrees, 44 minutes north latitude, 104 degrees, 59 minutes west longitude. So latitude is measured accurately from position of the sun on the equator. We can measure that out based on how the sun moves and its position consistently near the equator. The problem is longitude is a human creation and it's positioned from Greenwich, England. So when early explorers were trying to figure out where they were, they had a really hard time because longitude is not based off of the sun or stars. Telling time. We've got Greenwich Mean Time, GMT, which is located at the prime meridian, running right here through England. It's the standard reference for all time. As you go forward, we're progressing in hours. The other important line we see is the International Date Line, which is located at 180 degrees longitude, and it moves the clock back 24 hours. So as you go from London and you go backwards, we are reducing time by an hour. So of course, if it's 1832, which is, gosh, what is that? Let me think. I used to be a firefighter and they call us out based on those numbers. I haven't used it for like 10 years. So let me think. So what is 1832, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18. So that is 6:30 p.m., 6:30 p.m. in London. Then way over here in Texas, it's going to be 12:30 p.m. because we're going back in time because this is where time sets up and we're going backwards in time here. If we continue to go around the globe, we're going to cross the international date line where 24 hours has passed as we travel. Well, it's 12 hours from here or going back the other direction. So the interesting thing is, if you're on a ship, you could actually time travel or go back in time. If you're going west from the Pacific Ocean and you cross the international date line, you could go back a day. It's just interesting to think about. At the same time, here's the international date line where these guys wanted to be included over here and these guys wanted to be included over here. And it just kind of gets a little complicated. Contemporary tools for geographers. We have the Geographic Information Science, GIS science, where we analyze data about Earth from electronics. This is where we're going to start collecting all of our data. Remote sensing is a term we use when we talk about data collected from long distances. So perhaps there are tall towers, airplanes high up in the sky, or satellites. Global positioning system, the GPS, which is very common nowadays in everybody's cars and phones, these are tracking stations, long distance equipment to pinpoint locations. The difference is remote sensing is collecting data. GPS is tracking, positioning. You put them together, you've got a geographic information system, or GIS. And this analyzes data in layers. We've got this analyzation of perhaps we've got specific landforms and we've got highways, and we layer those two together along with cities. And we can start to come up with information about, well, why do people live in the city? Maybe it's because it was along a major highway, which is near a lake and with a beautiful view of the mountains. Something like that. That's how we work in geography. So let's look at chapter 1, key issue 2. I'm your host, Andrew Patterson. Why is each point on Earth unique? That's really important to us as geographers because we look at why people live where they do and how they interact with each other. So what makes a place unique? Place is a specific point on Earth distinguished by a particular characteristic. What's unique about where you live? For us, we live in Dallas, Texas. What's unique about that? Location is a position that something occupies. So where is Texas Stadium? Where is the ballpark in Arlington? That's the position that these places occupy. A toponym. This is a name given to a place on Earth. So if we talk about Coppell, Texas, that's a toponym. If we talk about the American Airlines Center, perhaps that's a place that's near the toponym of Dallas. Site is the physical characteristic. Site is the physical characteristic of a place. So if we are on a site, what is the physical characteristics of that place? Well, Dallas, we've got the Trinity River, we've got flat landscape, we have skyscrapers and things like that that are the physical characteristics. Situation is the location of a place relative to other places. So if we've got the American Airlines Center, what's its situation? Well, it's near downtown. It's across from the Trinity River. It's next to the rail line. It's southeast of the North Dallas Tollway. That is the situation. So we look about the site in China here, in Shanghai, China. The site, well, we've got a river, we've got some skyscrapers, we've got their tower here. That's our site. The situation of Shanghai is, it is on the west side of the East China Sea. It is at the mouth of the Yangtze River, and it's in eastern China. We look at region. What's unique about an area? A region is an area. A region is an area of the Earth defined by one or more distinctive characteristics. We start to put together pieces of this puzzle of geography to tell us why people live where they do, and how they interact with each other. And these are tools that we use to do that. When we look at the cultural landscape, which consequently is the title of this book, we're looking at a combination of cultural, economic, and physical features giving a region character. What's our cultural landscape in Texas? Is it that we wear cowboy hats and boots and we have cattle and we drive trucks? I mean, not really, but that's what people think, right? As part of our cultural landscape. So when we talk about regional studies, we look at why an area is fashioned from nature by culture or group. What about our nature in Texas is unique? And why do we have a cultural perspective of cattle and railroads and Western people wearing maybe guns on their hip and cowboy hats? Why is this region thought of like that? When we talk about regions, we're able to organize them using a few different terms here. If we talk about a formal region, otherwise also known as a uniform region, we look at an area where everyone shares common characteristics. For example, if I say Texas, that is a formally recognized region. We know that the borders are clearly defined. That is our region. Perhaps if we look at the political polls and we see that, well, which state's Democratic, which state is Republican. Maybe we look at Nebraska and that chooses one of those backgrounds. So that's going to be a formally recognized region. But formal regions are pretty clear to understand because they're formally recognized. Functional region is another way we organize areas. Formal, also known as nodal region, because this area is organized around a node or a focal point. So for example, if we have television stations, this is our functional region. Like this television station down here serves this functional region. There's a television station and everything revolves around it. When I worked for K10 Television in Denison, Texas, it was way up here north, almost in Oklahoma. So this television station perhaps served all of this region of North Texas. All right, but you can also have like a newspaper route or maybe a radio tower that only serves a certain area. Maybe you have a bus transit system that serves one area. This is a functional region. Then we've got the vernacular region or perceptual. This is what we perceive or this is what we speak of in our vernacular. This is an area that people believe exists as part of their cultural identity. What we mean by that is, if we say the South, what do you think of? Like, where do you think of when I say the South? What are some things that you think about? Well, I know commonly in our classes when we have this discussion, we're thinking about, well, it's the South. It's where people, they wear cowboy boots, they drive trucks, they wear trucker caps. Maybe they traditionally have grown cotton. And so you come up with these things that you perceive in your mind or that you think of as the South. And you can see that it's not a clear line because people think of the South in different ways. And it's not clear where those demarcations are because it's vernacular, it's perceived. But we still organize our understanding of regions and areas in that matter. Regions of culture. So what is culture? It's a body of customary beliefs, material traits, and social forms that together constitute the distinct tradition of a group or people. So culture is people's beliefs, the things that they have, and how they unite together to make up their traditions of the people that are in this area. Culture is what people care about, and it's what people take care of. Geographers study why customary ideas, beliefs, and values of people produce a distinctive culture in a location, in a place. Ways we look at that are language. How do people communicate? That makes part of their culture. What's their religion? What are their beliefs and practices? That's part of their culture. What's their ethnicity? And these things all go together into that, their physical traits, their language, and their religion. These are what people care about, and geographers look at that as part of culture. Culture is also what people take care of. What do they have? What's their material wealth? What kind of food do they eat? What clothing do they wear? Where do they live? How do they keep shelter from the elements? We also look at developed countries versus developing regions. We look at developed countries like, the United States. We've got healthcare, we've got education, we've got infrastructure, roads, hospitals, and such. And then we've got developing regions, areas that maybe don't have any of that or some of that. And we'll get more in depth down the line with that. But these are all things that make up people's culture. And definitely as geographers, we look at spatial association, meaning space, like not up in outer space, but areas, space, and how they are connected and organized. We look at data by scale, which is how zoomed in or out we are, and find varying conclusions. For example, if we look at the US scale, we see that the Great Lakes in the south have more cancer than the west. So here's the Great Lakes in the south, and we see they have much more cancer than the entire western area of the US. So based on that scale, this area seems to be the most covered with cancer cases. If we zoom into the state scale, we see that Eastern Maryland has more cancer than Western Maryland. I'm sorry, this is Maryland. We're looking over here. We're not over at the city yet. If we're looking at Eastern Maryland, we see that they have more cancer than Western Maryland. All right. And we're going to adjust our scale again, going all the way into the city. This is Baltimore now, within Maryland, within the United States. We see that lower levels of cancer are found in the northern portion of Baltimore. Well, why is that? That's what I love about geography. Now we ask why. Well, perhaps this area is away from factories. Perhaps this area is away from pollutants. Perhaps this area has a higher income people that are able to afford healthcare. Perhaps this area is fully educated and they know how to access products and take care of their health, so they're not getting as much cancer. But we look at all those things and put them together as geographers. Hello and welcome to Chapter 1, Key Issue 3, where we look at why are different places similar. So to do this, we look at scale. We could be looking at locally or all the way across the Earth globally. Scale is the relationship between a portion of the Earth and the Earth as a whole. When we do this, we're basically zooming in or zooming out. We're taking a look at various scales to analyze data in certain ways. One of the things we find is when we examine scale, if we're zoomed all the way out, we get into the term of globalization, which is the process that involves the entire world and results in making something worldwide in scope. When we examine scale, even if we zoom into a local scale, a lot of the times we're seeing aspects that are similar to different places across the globe. And this is where we really start to see globalization. For example, you look down here and we're seeing McDonald's, which is a development from the United States, but now we're seeing it in China and Dubai. We see it all across the globe. This is globalization. Globalization occurs in the economy where you've got finance and business intertwined because people are doing transactions across the globe. Maybe they're physically having business in the United States, but they're still selling things in Europe, or it's being created in Asia. They're putting parts together in South Africa. It's a global economy these days. Those corporations are not just based in the United States, but they now have their operations transnationally, meaning in multiple countries. What this actually is a division of labor. At one time, a company in the United States would exist solely in our country. They would manufacture all of their parts and put the object together, maybe if it was a car. But nowadays, labor is divided through multiple countries. And then when we look at the global economy, we had the housing bubble of 2008. This is really a key moment because what we had is housing prices that were very high. They were inflated, meaning they were higher than what their true value was. And the banks were lending out money to people that really couldn't afford to pay their loans. And things started to go bad. People started to default on their loans. And it didn't just affect people in the United States. It affected people globally because money is so tied together these days. This is where we start to see that we're not just individuals in the United States. We are tied to the larger global community. So that was the economy, but also we've got the globalization of culture, where we see increasingly uniform landscapes. Uniform meaning everything looks the same. Landscape meaning area where we are. So it's getting difficult to tell if we're in Dallas, Texas, or Chicago, or China, or Dubai, because we look down the street and there's a McDonald's, there's a Starbucks, there's a Walmart, and it all starts to look the same. And really the only thing that might be different, so we can get an idea of where we are, is the physical landscape, like mountains or rivers. So globalization of culture is becoming more and more prevalent or more common. We've got these fast food chains, gas stations, retail chains, religions. More and more, we're starting to see religions that are very similar, and we certainly have a very diverse tradition of religions across the earth, but there's religions that become more common as culture spreads because that religion is integrated in that culture. And then English, it's becoming one of the most commonly used languages because business is done in English. Scale is also considered in the distribution of features. We talk about space, and we're not talking about outer space, we're talking about an area that we're looking at. Space is the physical gap between two objects. Distribution, this is the arrangement of a feature in a space. How is it distributed? Geographers use spatial thinking to look at the arrangement of people and activities in a certain space and ask why they are distributed in that manner. Density is the frequency that something occurs. Concentration is the extent or the spread. And then, of course, we've got the pattern of how that occurs. The pattern is a geometric arrangement of objects. You think about pattern, many cities are designed by a grid pattern, where they're like, okay, we want this road, and it's going to cross-section this road, and it's all going to be neat and organized. The problem with that is it's a nice pattern, but you have stoplights that lock everybody up all the time. And in fact, the U.S. Land Ordinance of 1785 actually did divide the country into townships, little blocks that were 6 miles by 6 miles, and a grid of the entire country. When we apply some of these terms that help us look at the distribution of features, it starts to make more sense. So we look at baseball teams in the United States back in the 1950s. And you had them all distributed up here in the northeast part of the country. Why was that? Well, that's because that's where the majority of the population was. So this area was very dense, very thick with baseball teams. But as we move towards the new millennium, 2013, we see that the baseball teams are spread out all over the country. They have been distributed across the country. They are less dense now. Now they're kind of dense in California and still in the northeast, but their concentration is definitely spread out. What is our cultural identity in a space? Well, the distribution across a space. How is religion, language, ethnicity spread in an area? For example, why do boys play baseball and girls maybe go to ballet within a certain cultural group? How do we define ourselves? What is our cultural? How is that distributed across a space? We also look at how it moves across a space. Our traditional roles and relationships influence how people move within a space. So, for example, if we look by gender, traditionally, not so much these days in this country, but traditionally, you see the males or the husbands that are going to work and coming back again. That's moving across a space. Traditionally, you would have seen maybe the female, the wife, stay home and take care of the kids and shuttle them to maybe soccer practice, things like that. How has that changed now? Well, now we know it's much more equal. Females are going to work, and you see males staying home to take care of the kids, or maybe both are going to work, and they're using a service to drop the kids off at like daycare, and they're shuttling them to practices. So our culture is changing over time through the movement and through our distribution. We also look at ethnicity. Examine our city, Dallas, Texas. We look at ethnicities. Which neighborhood have mainly ethnicities of one color? Like, can we go to certain parts of a city and find certain ethnicities? These days, that's still true. We can find certain ethnicities in certain areas of the city because, in general, people like to stay with people of similar background. But there's also many more factors that go into it, which we'll get into. Contemporary culture, identity. Contemporary meaning these days. So right now, it's important to consider multiple perspectives regarding space to examine distinctive spatial patterns by aspects such as gender, race, ethnicity, and religion. What does that even mean? Well, let's dig in with some examples. Because if we're contemporary, we're up to date, we're in current time, and we want to look at gender, race, ethnicity, and religion. We want to identify aspects, pieces of data from our culture that might help us to understand why things are the way they are, why people live where they do, and how they connect. Well, if we look at the data for same-sex couples, we can see where they live. And then we start to ask questions. Well, why are same-sex couples highest in these regions right here? That's a question we try to answer as geographers. And then we look at a global scale for the entire Earth, and we look at the data on, is gay marriage accepted? You can see the regions in green where it is accepted, and you can see where it is not. Why maybe is gay marriage not accepted in Northern Africa? Why maybe is it accepted in South America? These are questions we ask. One of the most important things we examine is the connection between places. Connection, obviously, relationships among people and objects across the barrier of space. How do things that are in two different locations connect? The first thing we look at is the hearth, the place for which an innovation originates. What is the hearth of baseball? What is the hearth of a disease? We look at where it begins, and then we see how it diffuses, process by which it moves or spreads across the globe or an area, where it originated and how it diffused. There's two different kinds of diffusion we're looking at here. The first is relocation diffusion, which is the spread by physical movement of people from one place to another, meaning they take a trait or characteristic, they physically move from one place to another, and they have it now in the new area where they are. First example of this is when the English language was diffused from Europe to North America. You had people that were moving during colonization, they relocated from Europe to North America, and they diffused the English language. The second example of that is the euro. The coins that they used in Europe, they originated from individual countries that minted their own coins. So, for example, if you had a French euro, you'd have something that was representative of France on that coin, and it would diffuse because people would take their coin and they would travel, they would move to a new country within Europe. So they started to see that these coins would relocate because people were taking them there. The other kind of diffusion is called expansion diffusion, which is the spread in an additive process, meaning as it moves, more people access that expansion. It expands like exponentially. It gets a lot bigger. Whereas relocation doesn't necessarily get bigger. It's just people moving. There's three forms of expansion diffusion. First, there's hierarchical diffusion, which is a spread at certain levels. You think of it as a certain hierarchy. Like the easiest way is to think, okay, there's a hierarchy like kings, and they're in charge. So if they're going to spread information, it's going to go in a certain pattern. Examples we look at is soccer, because it spread through certain soccer clubs that had the time to do this recreational sport. And we'll talk more about this later too. And the other is rap music, because it started in urban areas, and it spread from urban area to urban area to urban area because it was a certain demographic of people that were listening to this rap music. It was a certain level of people. The next is contagious diffusion. It's rapid, widespread throughout an entire population. Contagious diffusion takes on everybody because it doesn't care what your hierarchy is. It doesn't care if you're a king or if you're like a poor farm worker. If you get sick, if you get the flu, it doesn't matter what your hierarchy is. Like everybody is in trouble. Everybody can get it. So flu is an example of contagious diffusion. Examples on ideas on the internet. This is contagious diffusion because whoever has the internet, they've got access to it. It spreads rapidly. Everybody can see it. Everybody can have access. The third is stimulus diffusion, which is the spread of an underlying principle. Meaning you have an original idea and part of that spreads, even though it could be a totally different medium. Examples would be like features of the iPhone. You know, whenever iPhone and Apple comes out with a new idea, let's say it's like being able to touch your screen, which back in the day, we just had to press buttons on our phone. So when the iPhone came out with being able to use your finger to touch any feature on your screen, that was huge. So it wasn't necessarily the iPhone that spread across the globe, although it did. But what stimulus diffusion was about it is that other companies, other brands of phones started to use people touching the screen of their phone with their finger. So that idea spread through stimulus diffusion. Same thing with the Big Mac. The Big Mac is a big American, meaty, cheesy hamburger. Well, McDonald's spread into India, but the Big Mac did not spread to India. The original idea didn't spread to India. Why? Because they don't eat meat in India for the most part. Okay, they've got like the veggie burger there in India. So the original idea of the Big Mac didn't spread, but through stimulus diffusion, McDonald's did spread to India. Relocation diffusion. So you look at the euro coins. So this is the number of people, the number of purses carrying euro coins in February 2002. Not very many. Okay, but as we move across the years, we see that because people are moving, people are visiting, and they're transplanting their coins, we can see that there's so many euro coins now in Paris, in France. This is occurring because of relocation diffusion. Hierarchical diffusion. We look at the hierarchy of the Ford Motor Company. Let's say the executive chairman here, he's the man in charge, he has a memo that he needs to get out. How does it spread to his company? By certain levels, by hierarchy. He passes his memo on saying, we're going to sell only red cars now. So he passes that message on to the president and CEO. It goes by hierarchy or levels, and then it spreads out to people below him. Then it spreads out to hundreds of people below them, and then thousands of people below them. It moves by hierarchy. Contagious diffusion. It doesn't matter. You're going to get it. This is text messaging. You see how text messaging spread through contagious diffusion. You can see how everybody in Texas is text messaging. When it originated here in Oklahoma, everybody starts getting it. All right. But also, what's fun is to think about it is like a scary contagious virus. Like, okay, the virus initiated here in Texas, and then it spread contagiously all throughout the region. Everyone's in trouble of getting it. This is text messaging through a 1-month sample in each of these states. We also look at the spatial interaction, how things are able to connect and work with each other in spite of the space between them. One of the things that we see is distance decay, where we've got contact diminishing with increasing distance. So if I'm hanging out with my buddy Jordan and we live next to each other, it's easy for us to communicate. We just walk next door and we talk. But if he moves to Egypt, that distance decay, because he's a long way from me, perhaps, and this is sad, we don't really communicate as much anymore because he's in Egypt and that's a long way for me to get. So our spatial interaction is the blockade that keeps us from interacting. But the thing we see happening now because of technology is space-time compression, or the reduction in time for something to reach another place. And this can happen in a number of different ways. Now we've got our phones. Now we've got Skype. Now we've got FaceTime, where I can just call Jordan in Egypt and talk to him on the phone. It's like he's almost right there. Or I can get on a plane and be there in a number of hours instead of maybe days or weeks or a month. This network, this chain of communication is what connects people and places. But we still, on our Earth, have uneven development. We've got an increasing gap in economic conditions between regions. A lot of what we see is in developed countries, or more developed countries like the United States, we see a lot of the resources and technology and development and infrastructure being placed there. And there's a number of reasons for this that we're going to get into. Same thing with Europe. So we have lots of technology. So when I want to talk with Jordan, I can, because I've got the technology. He had it from the United States, and he went to maybe Egypt, and we're able to communicate because development for us was very high. But if we're someone that's born or growing up in sub-Saharan Africa, we are not as developed. We are most likely not going to have the cell phones. We're not going to be able to buy plane tickets. So our distance decay remains. And in fact, you see on this chart here the GNI of development between countries. You look at just the monetary value. Developed countries have so much more buying power, so much more ability to travel and communicate, as opposed to developing countries. So here's the world average. It's not even close to what developed countries like the United States have. Developing countries, they still have got a long way to go. Our advantage is huge. Their disadvantage is difficult to overcome. And of course, we still have an income gap within our own country. We look at the wealth just in the United States. So here's the top 1% of income earners. You can see that in 1980, it was kind of close. The people who earn the most money in this country, like the executives and the financial owners, they're close to us. But then it's just started to get ridiculous. Nowadays, those who earn money at the top 1% have so much more money than the rest of us. This income gap is just like from the previous slide between countries. It's huge. It is almost insurmountable. Like, how is someone who's an average middle-class citizen, a teacher like me, how am I ever going to be able to keep up with someone who's in this top 1%? It's not possible. And then the problem is, here's middle-class people like me, and then here's the poorest. We're so close nowadays. The issue is income distribution has not spread equally. We see this globally, and when we zoom in by scale, we see this within our own country. Sustainable. Sustainability of resources. So a resource is a substance in the environment that is useful to people, economically and technologically feasible to access, and socially acceptable to use. Interesting that they put in there socially acceptable, because we're looking at this oil pumper here, and there is some commentary on if people are feeling like the continued use of petroleum is acceptable or not, but that's definitely a resource. A renewable resource is produced by nature more rapidly than it is consumed by humans. Meaning we can use it and we're going to get it back because nature is going to recreate it. A non-renewable resource is produced in nature more slowly than it is consumed by humans. And these are the things that we really want to make sure that we are protecting and not using up. Sustainability is using resources in a way that ensure availability in the future. So certainly one of the concerns of living on this planet is that we want to have an aspect of sustainability. We don't want to use everything up and have nothing left. Because let's face it, any planet we look out and see doesn't look as good as Earth at this point. The 3 pillars of sustainability. Well, the United Nations, this is the governing body that's really had its hand on making sure that there's laws in place to make sure the planet is cared for, suggests that sustainability rests on 3 pillars, as discussed in the Our Common Future, which is the report created by Brundtland, and it's also known as the Brundtland Report back in 1987. And the 3 pillars are environment, economy, and society. In the environment aspect, we look at conservation. Can we have sustainable use of things that we might lose should we overuse them? And can we have preservation, maintain things in their present condition? As far as the economy aspect, we're looking at supply and demand and how that determines affordability. If we have sustainability issues, but there's products that are really cheap to get, it's going to be difficult for us to keep things sustainable. It's going to be difficult for us to rationalize not using a resource because it's too expensive perhaps to go the opposite direction and do sustainable practices. We have to consider the economy. So as sustainability becomes cheaper, more people will move that direction. Meaning, if wind energy is more expensive than petroleum or fuel-based energies, it's going to be hard to get people to go towards wind energy just because it's more expensive. So sustainability depends on the economy. And society is the 3rd pillar of sustainability. When consumer choices can support sustainability, people embrace it as a value. Meaning, if consumers are concerned about sustainability, they can support it as a society. If they can afford it as a society, they'll embrace it as a value. These 3 things we must consider in order for our planet to be sustainable. But you've also got critics of sustainability, people who don't necessarily agree with the policies or the idea of sustainability. Some people say it's too late. The World Wildlife Fund claims that the world passed a sustainable level around 1980. They said, there's too many people on the planet. There's 7 to 9 billion already. There's only going to be more. We're using up resources more than resources are being created naturally. It's already too late. Some critics also say that the Earth's resources have no limits, so we shouldn't be concerned about sustainability. They're saying we have more than enough resources. The environmental improvements that we can do as a people can be achieved with careful assessment. So if we just manage our resources better, they really wouldn't have a limit. And still others claim that sustainability really is just propaganda. They say that sustainability is there is no sustainability issue. It doesn't exist. Like, the planet is able to take care of itself. And there is concern about the laws and regulations that are created to reduce national and personal sovereignty. Meaning, if you have a governing body that is over the entire planet and they put laws in place, they are going to have control over, like, the United States, because this global community would have laws that supersede, that go above the United States. And their fear is that we would lose our sovereignty. We would lose our ability to govern ourselves. And so these are the critics of sustainability. The Earth's physical systems. We take a look at the physical systems and landscapes in place. Well, we've got abiotic systems, which are composed of non-living organic matter. It's not alive. And within this abiotic system, we've got the atmosphere, hydrosphere, and lithosphere. In the atmosphere, of course, we've got the thin layer of gases surrounding the Earth. In the hydrosphere, we consider all the water on and near the surface of the Earth. In the lithosphere, it encompasses the Earth's crust and the upper mantle. So that's the abiotic system. In the biotic system, we've got living organisms. The biosphere is within the biotic system. This is where all living organisms on Earth, including plants and animals, exist. And that encompasses a number of the abiotic systems when you put them together. The atmosphere, it's got thin layers of gases surrounding the Earth and goes all the way up to 300 miles. And what we've been told is that it's held in by Earth's gravity. So as Earth spins around, so does the atmosphere, pretty much at the same speed as the rotating globe. It consists of 78% nitrogen, 28%, 21% oxygen, 0.9% argon, 0.036 carbon dioxide, and 0.64 other gases. When we have variations in pressure, that causes weather. Climate is the long-term weather condition at a particular location. So it's not just weather, like what's your weather today, it's climate, where we recognize long-term weather conditions. So when we think of a climate of an area, we think, well, what's the climate of Texas? Well, it's mostly kind of hot, and we do get some seasons in here, but what's the climate of the Amazon jungle? Okay, it's really hot and rainy. These are just weather patterns over a long period of time. But we do have specifically climate regions as designed by Köppen. The A climate region is tropical. The B climate region is dry. The C climate region is warm to mid-latitude. The D is cold to mid-latitude. We're over here. And E is polar. And this is the official breakdown for our climate regions. When you look across this map, this graphic here, you can sense, based on the equator, how things line up in relation to those climate regions. The hydrosphere, water. We've got oceans, lakes, rivers, groundwater, glacial ice, and vapor in the atmosphere. Over 97% of the world's water is in the oceans. So basically, think about that. It's all salt water. Just 3%. 3% there is left over for fresh water in lakes, rivers, and groundwater, and glacial ice. Oceans provide water vapor in the form of evaporation, which returns to Earth as fresh water precipitation, as rain. So water is essential for life. We know this. The climate of a location influences human activities, especially growing food. And that's based off what we find in the hydrosphere because of the water. Here we see people in India covering up from the annual monsoons that bring water to their tropical climate region. It's not like what we have here in the United States. These people have to wait for their once-a-year rain. The lithosphere. This is the crust and a portion of the mantle, which extends down 45 miles. The interesting thing is, we haven't been able to dig down 45 miles. We've been able to dig down, I believe it's 15 kilometers, which the Russians did. And they tried in the 80s for a number of years to extend beyond 15 kilometers, and they could not do it. No matter what happened, no matter what drill bit and dynamite and anything, they couldn't get past 15 kilometers. It seems to be the magic number going deep. So I have to ask, okay, I'm sure you have specific scientific experiments and data, but how do you know what's below 15 kilometers? How do you know what's down 45 miles? In any case, the lithosphere, this is Earth's features and landforms, and it's called geomorphology, and it helps explain why people live where they do. Because if you have a feature like a mountain, people don't tend to live high up. If you've got flat plains, people tend to live there, especially when we think about historic civilization growing, because that's where food was able to be grown, on the flat plains. In the lithosphere, we can examine topographical maps. So, for example, you see northwestern Mississippi here, and you see the high points and the low points. The biosphere, all of Earth's living organisms. This is where they live. It includes portions of all other three abiotic systems as well. An ecosystem, this is a group of living organisms, and the abiotic spheres within the interact. Within this area, all of them come together. We've got living organisms, abiotic backdrops, plants, animals. That's the ecosystem. Ecology is the study, scientifically, of these ecosystems. So human geographers are interested in ecosystems because they're involved with the interactions of humans and the biosphere. In human geography, we look at why people live, where they do, and how they interact with each other. The study of the physical landscape throughout the biosphere helps us do that. We look at, is there enough water for life? If there is, people may live there. Are there pollutants? Is that going to push people away? Is that going to cause issues to the plant and animal life? Will we have enough oxygen in an area? Is there too much CO2 being put off? Can we find fuel for energy? How is that going to affect our ability to live in a clean environment? How can we find more land to grow more food? As we continue to grow in population on this earth, are we going to have enough land? If we chop down the rainforests, are we going to have enough oxygen? Within the biosphere, we look at erosion as well. This is where the soil washes or blows away. And as we cut down trees, we know that we do have issues with erosion. And also we think about the depletion of nutrients, the overuse. As we cut down trees to farm and our population grows and we have so many people that need to be fed, we tend to multi-crop, where we're planting more and more crops per season, and we're not giving those fields time to replenish their nutrients. That is an issue within the biosphere. Cultural ecology. This is the geographic study of human-environment relationships, where we combine culture and the environment. One of the terms within cultural ecology is environmental determinism, which is the physical environment causes social development. What aspects of our physical landscape cause people to develop there? This understanding and research was pioneered by German geographers Alexander von Humboldt and Karl Ritter. After them, we've got Friedrich Ratzel and Ellen Churchill Semple, who claim geography studies influence of natural environment on people. It's the same kind of thing. They extend on it. Like, okay, the natural environment, people are going to live on this lake because they're able to fish there. They're able to travel across that lake faster than they would over a mountain. And it's finished up by Ellsworth Huntington, who argued that climate was a major determinant of civilization. I mean, that seems like common sense nowadays, right? But if you think that people in a cold climate, they're not able to grow crops, so it's not really going to thrive there. If you're in the lush basket lands of the middle United States, and we're able to irrigate and utilize a little bit deeper underneath the topsoil there on the plains, we're going to have one of the best agricultures on the planet in the United States of America. This is environmental determinism. The physical landscape causes social development. We also look at possibilism. The physical environment may limit some human actions, but people have the ability to adjust to their environment. This is the opposite of environmental determinism. It's actually a rejection of environmental determinism, because possibilism says people learn to adjust and grow different crops depending on the climate. So possibilism says what's possible in an area? Well, more than environmental determinism, because people were smart and were able to adjust, and we can grow using technologies that were not limited by the environment. For example, when we talk about cultural ecology, we look at the culture of how people use their lands. So why in the United States do we plant a front yard with grass and then trim it down? Why not just let it grow? How do our cultural values impact the environment? Well, here, our environment, we trim it down, it looks very nice and green, but a lot of times we put pesticides and herbicides and fertilizers on this land, and it impacts the environment. But it looks good, right? Well, what about here? What if it's totally natural and it still looks kind of lush, but it's just different from what our culture expects? These are interesting things when we discuss human geography, specifically cultural ecology. When we modify our environment, we change it. We look at the Netherlands, and in their textbook, it states that this is a form of sustainable ecosystem, where they've got a polder. Here's the Netherlands over here. Polder is land created by draining water. So the Netherlands is infamous for creating land from what used to be water. So, for example, this Weeders Wee works here. This is just used to be all underwater. So they just drained the water and created more land, and they use it for farming. The other aspect that they do in the Netherlands is they have dikes. These are big walls that hold back water. The concern in the Netherlands is that the rising seawater from global warming potentially would flood over the dikes and flood their farmlands as well. And in the text, it also does mention that there were pesticides, herbicides, and fertilizers used in a lot of these areas, and they were concerned about that pollution, so they started to let it go back to just fallow lands as well. In contrast to that, our text says that there is an unsustainable ecosystem in South Florida. And we look over here, we see the Everglades, the very famous Everglades where you see alligators and marshlands down here in South Florida. Well, they said that the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers built levees blocking water flow from Lake Okeechobee to the Everglades to create land to grow crops. So here's Lake Okeechobee. And what they've done is they've created levees and they block the water flow. So they've cut off the Everglades, and it's been good because they've created farmlands and been able to build houses and such in this area. But at the same time, you're getting a lot of pollution from the growth of industry and residential housing. And what the text states is cattle that were along these new levees that were built. A lot of pollution, and it started to kill fish and vegetation down here in our natural preserve here in the Everglades Natural Park. So what we have seen, as stated in the textbook, is that we've lost half of the Everglades due to development, due to houses and infrastructure and roads and hospitals and industry. So on the one hand, we were able to build more places for people to live, and that's important in South Florida because it's very expensive in that area and people want to move there. It's got a climate that populations want to live in. But at the same time, at what cost? We've lost the Everglades. We've lost half of the Everglades, as the text states, and that's a problem because we want to maintain our ecosystem. So this is a look at chapter 1. We've got major population clusters. There's 4 areas where you see tons of people. We've got East Asia, where you're looking at Japan and parts of China. We have South Asia, India, Europe, of course, and Southeast Asia, where you've got Indonesia. Other clusters where you find lots of people, populations concentrated, would be on the northeastern seaboard of the United States and Canada and the Atlantic coast of Africa. You're going to want to remember where these major clusters of populations are. Sparsely populated regions, where people don't live. Typically, people don't want to live in areas that are dry, like a desert. They don't want to live in places that are wet, like the marshlands down in Florida here. You just can't build a house there. You don't want to live in areas that are cold because you can't grow crops. And you don't want to live in high lands, like up on the mountaintops, because it's too cold and it's rocky and it's difficult to grow anything. The Ecumen is a portion of the Earth's surface occupied by human settlement. And you can see back here in AD year 1 that the Ecumen was fairly large, where people weren't living in the Amazon jungles or in sub-Saharan Africa. The Ecumen, this is where they do live. So people are living in this lush land here along the coast of the Amazon jungles. They're living in sub-Saharan Africa. They're not living in the deserts of Africa. And they're not living in Siberia area of what is now Russia because it's just too cold. You can't get things to grow. But they are living around the water where they can irrigate their crops, where they can move a little bit more freely because of the water, and they can transport goods and connect with other cultures. Fast forward to the 1900s, and you can see that the Ecumen has greatly expanded due to technological advancements, due to population growing. People have just naturally needed to spread out, so the Ecumen is much larger, but you still don't see people living in the desert. You still don't see people living up here in the Arctic Circle of North America and of Asia. Population density. There's a few specific ways we look at that. One thing we measure is arithmetic density, which would be the total number of people divided by total land. All it is how many people are living in an area. When we look at the Earth, we can see where we have major population clusters using arithmetic density. You can see that India, of course, is one of the most populated countries in the world, along with China. Lots of dense situations where people are packed in there. Another way we organize the data about population is through physiological density, which is the number of people supported by a unit area of land. And when we talk about physiological density, what we mean is with arable land, that's land that's suitable for farming. So it's important to look at it through physiological density because people are going to try to pack in wherever they can. And some places, like the United States, have a lot of farming land. So it's going to be more land to support more people, as opposed to like Egypt, where it really only has arable land around the Nile River, and it needs to support a whole mass population. So that number is going to be a lot higher for a small amount of land. And then finally, we look at agricultural density, which is the ratio of number of farmers to the amount of arable land. It's kind of the same situation with physiological density, where we're looking at the number of farmers and land that is suitable for farming, but it depends on your society. Like, for example, in the United States, our ratio of farmers is pretty low because nowadays it's very commercialized. So one professional farmer is feeding thousands of people, whereas in sub-Saharan Africa, perhaps everybody's a farmer because they don't have infrastructure. They don't have farming techniques. They don't have businesses and such as much as we do. So everybody's going to be growing their own crops. We look specifically at physiological density, which is the people supported by arable land. What we've got is the Nile River here in Egypt. It has to support on this one strip of land that's fertilized or irrigated by the Nile River. It has to support this dense population in Egypt. That's why the physiological density is so high. Same thing over here in Colombia. You've got dense jungle lands where you can't really farm. So the small amounts of land that they do have to support a large population. Agricultural density, which is the ratio of farmers per arable land. Again, everybody over here in India and China, not everybody, but large amounts of the population are farmers. So the ratio is going to be more equal. Like everybody's farmers, so everybody's working on that arable land. As opposed to Brazil, where most people are in a developed situation where they're working in cities, so you're going to have very few farmers. Same thing with the United States and places in Europe. So let's look at key issue 1. Key issue 2, why is population increasing? We've got a whole bunch of people on this planet, and it seems like we're getting more and more. Well, let's look at the components of population growth, ways we define and organize information about why it might be growing. First, we've got the crude birth rate, or the CBR, which is the total number of live births in a year for every 1,000 people. So basically, how many babies are we having? If we're in a country that's having a lot of babies, then our population is probably going to grow. But we also look at the crude death rate, the CDR, which is the total number of deaths in a year for every 1,000 people. Well, if we're having a lot of babies, our birth rate is up, but our death rate is also up, then our population isn't going to grow very much. But if we're having a high CBR, low CDR, like we're not having people die, then our population is going to grow because we're having a bunch of kids and people are not dying. The natural increase rate, or the NIR, is the percentage by which the population grows in a year. And how we calculate that is by subtracting the death rate from the birth rate. So for example, if our CBR is 20 and our CDR is 5, we've got an NIR of 15. The percentage breakdown would be 1.5%. We look over here at our population over history. And of course, 8,000 BC, we've got a very low population. And it stays that way for a long time. And it's only until around the 1800s where we see the effects of the Industrial Revolution that the population starts to explode exponentially. And as we look, as the time of this book was published and written in 2012, our population is up to over 7 billion people. And as geographers, we ask, why is that? Well, we can talk about that the birth rate's up, the death rate is down. But we also dig in further and ask, well, why is the birth rate up? Why are less people dying? Natural increase. During the 21st century, the world's NIR has been 1.2, which basically means we're growing. About 82 million people are added each year. More than 95% of the natural increase rate is from developing countries, meaning there isn't necessarily a lot of growth here in the United States or in Europe. The growth is all happening in countries that are still developing. Why is that? Because they are developing, meaning they're getting technologies and medicines and they're able to extend their lives, so people are living longer. At the same time, they're still developing countries, so people are having lots and lots of kids. In sub-Saharan Africa, which is where we are right now, the increase rate exceeds 2.0, meaning people are doubling the amount of kids that they're having. I mean, it's growing exponentially. In Europe, the NIR is negative, meaning people are not really having kids and the population is actually kind of dying off. It's getting smaller. The NIR of the USA is 0.6, meaning it's pretty low, but our population continues to grow. So what's up with that? Well, immigration is what brings in people to the United States in a steady stream. We've seen the major growth in Africa and in Asia. In Europe and North America, you can see that the NIR is a lot lower. But again, population increases in the United States because of immigration. Doubling time is one of the things that we look at. Doubling time is the number of years needed to double a population. So if you've got a bunch of people having babies and living a long time, the doubling time is not going to be very long because the population is going to double very quickly. But if you're up here in Scandinavia and people are not really having babies because the population is developed and people are at work and they're in school, then it's going to take a long time to reach your doubling time. And as you can see in this graph here, world population is going up at a steady rate. The annual increase is going to continually go up, but not as fast as the population, while our natural increase rate has gone down a little bit. Why is that? Okay, well, at the beginning, when people all over the earth were exploding in population, you can see that bump there. But as we get closer to developed countries here in 2015, our natural increase rate percentage goes down actually because the developed countries aren't increasing in that manner. So we look at the crude birth rate. As geographers, we try to understand why people are having lots of babies. What's going on? Why are babies being born in the United States? Why are tons of babies being born in sub-Saharan Africa? And by the way, we say sub-Saharan because the Sahara Desert's right here and everything below that is sub. So in the United States, we have things like healthcare, where we have birth control methods. Women are in school more. Women are working in jobs, so they're not staying home and having lots of babies. There's not a reason for them to because farmers are typically in the United States run by corporations or individuals. Families aren't really staying at home to grow crops. As opposed to sub-Saharan Africa, where it is still a developing continent of countries, and they are having lots of kids because not everybody in the family lives as long and they need the help to raise crops. At the same time, they don't have birth control really, so they're having lots of kids. The birth rate is very high. Fertility, the ability to have kids. The total fertility rate is the average number of children a woman will have during her childbearing years, which is typically from age 15 to 49, but that does fluctuate. Again, we look at the fertility rate in the United States. What's the fertility rate of a female in childbearing years in the United States? Okay, well, it's going to be maybe 2. Maybe we're going to have 2 kids. Sub-Saharan Africa, it's way higher. They're going to have 4 or even more. They're having lots of kids. Again, for the reasons of they don't have birth control. They're not educated about such things. They're not going to school instead of staying home. They need to have kids to help them grow their farms. So that's why these things are occurring. Mortality, combined with our death rate for all developing countries, is lower than the combined rate for all developed countries. Meaning, it's interesting that the mortality rate, the death rate for the developing countries is lower than the combined rate for all developed countries. Because you think about, well, developed countries are probably going to have a lower death rate, and that's true to a certain extent. But what happens is people start to live longer in the developing countries, and so they're not dying at a fast rate as compared to the developed countries who have an aging older population and higher population. For example, Denmark, it's wealthy and developed. It has a higher death rate than Cape Verde, which is very poor. That's because Cape Verde is developing and people are living longer. And in Denmark, you've got an aging older population where people are dying and it's a larger population. Same thing. USA has a higher death rate than Mexico. Why is this? Well, more than what I've said, we're going to dig into the demographic transition model. And this is going to be discussed later in the chapter, like the next key issue. Population pyramids. These are really cool. You look at them right now, maybe if you haven't seen them, and you're like, what is this? This makes no sense. But I actually like these. They're kind of fun to look at. Population pyramids show the percentage of total population in 5-year age groups, for the most part. And we start with the youngest people at the bottom and the older generations at the top. Males on the left, females on the right. And you can see the ages here, age 0 to 4, all the way up to age 85 and beyond, male and female. So we're going to start by looking at the United States. You can see our population is pretty even here. We've got people that are babies, teens, 20s, 30s. And as we get older, it starts to get smaller in population because as we get up towards the 80s, people don't live as long. Switch over to Lawrence, Kansas, which is still in the United States, but this is a very specific city and situation, and this is really interesting. You look at it here. Okay, this part's kind of similar to the United States, but why in the world do we have these 2 arms off here? What is going on? Well, think about that. Well, what's the age group? Okay, it's like late teens, early 20s. Okay, well, there's late teens and early 20s on both sides of the pyramid. Where's the situation we're going to find late teens and early 20s? What is going on in Lawrence, Kansas? What are people doing there? Well, there is a college in Lawrence, Kansas called the University of Kansas, and that's where people are going to school, this age group. See, Lawrence, Kansas is a small town, but they have this big university where there's a huge population of male and female students in their late teens, early 20s. And that's why we see this age population sticking out here. Naples, Florida, an upside down pyramid. We've got not very many young people and a whole bunch of old people. Why are we going to have a whole bunch of old people in Florida? Well, You may have heard that Florida, specifically Naples, is home to a retirement community where people from across the country move to because the weather's nice, the beaches, the geographic setting is beautiful, and they have a community of people that are like them. So lots of people retire in their older years to Florida, specifically Naples. And then Laredo, Texas. What's going on here? It's kind of like the overall population pyramid of the United States, but really the bottom's a lot wider. What is going on in these earlier ages? Well, Texas, okay, that's southern, kind of middle portion of the United States. What could be going on where this population is growing like that? Well, Laredo specifically is on the border. Who's coming across the border to add to the population? We've got Latin American immigrants, young families who are coming over to find jobs, both male and female. So you can see why it's a wider population pyramid on the bottom there. The dependency ratio, this is the number of people too young or too old to work compared to those working age. You look at Naples, Florida, and we've got a problem because this young people who can work, they're not going to be able to support this older population. There's too many of them. Same thing over here. If we've got a bunch of babies here in Laredo, Texas, our older generation is not going to be able to keep working and support them. These are things we look at as geographers. And the other thing we look at is sex ratio, or people's gender, where it's the number of males per 100 females. Developed countries have more females because they live longer, meaning typically women live longer than females. So in developed countries where people live longer, there's going to be more females. And as we look here at the dependency ratio of the Earth, we can see that there's a whole bunch of people that are under the age of 15. Of course, we've already talked about Sub-Saharan Africa. There's a whole bunch of kids being born over here. And our gender, the sex ratio, where we've got equal, is in these tan areas here. When there's a lot more men than women, we see a lot of Middle Eastern and Asian countries here. I wonder why that is. We're going to get into that. And more women than men. And as we just discussed, in developed countries, you're starting to see more women than men because typically they live longer. That's our look at key issue 2. Chapter 2, key issue 3. Why does population growth vary among regions? Why do certain regions grow and others don't? Well, in order to discover that, we're going to look at the demographic transition model. The demographic transition is the process in change of a society's population from where we're seeing a lot of people being born, a lot of people dying, and not very much growth overall, to not very many people are being born, not very many people are dying, and we're still not seeing very many people growing in population because we already have a high population because we've gone through the 4 stages. This is what we're going to look at overall, the demographic transition model. Stage 1, we've got low growth. This stage, we have a very high birth rate, but also we've got a high death rate because people are dying. This doesn't produce any long-term natural increase. What's going on is, this is way back in human history for the most part, where they didn't have medicines, they didn't have technologies, maybe they were just hunters and gatherers, so living situation is not good. Sure, they're going to have a lot of babies because there's virtually no birth control, but people are going to die because there's no way to save them through medicines, there's no technology, there's no hospitals, they don't know how to grow food. So most of human history is in this stage, meaning back thousands of years ago, they were in this stage, all the way up to about the 1800s when we switched over to stage 2. So in the course of everything on this earth, stage 1 lasted the longest. It's only recently where we started to see population explosions. No country currently is in stage 1 because we've all moved to stage 2. We've experienced population growth in every single country. Stage 2, this is where we have rapidly declining death rates and very high birth rates, which creates a very high natural increase rate. Basically, people are having lots of babies, but people are living longer because we started to integrate some technology, some medicines that allow us to live a longer period of time. Europe and North America entered stage 2 after 1750 because of the Industrial Revolution. This is where we started to see major improvements in manufacturing and delivering goods to the market, meaning we have the ability now to sustain a population. We can get food to larger populations. We can get medicines and supplies to more people. Stage 2, development, diffused to Africa, Asia, and Latin America around 1950s, much later, because of distance decay. Because Europe went through these changes first, and North America because people from Europe went to North America. It diffused later to Africa, Asia, and Latin America because their distance decay, they're farther away. But what brought it there wasn't necessarily the Industrial Revolution, although that did diffuse there eventually. It was the medical revolution, where people in these areas saw improved medical practices, which greatly reduced deaths and increased the years of how long people live. Stage 3, we start to see decreasing growth. This is where birth rates decline, death rates continue to go down, and the natural increase rate begins to level off. Okay, in stage 2, we had people that were having lots of babies. People were living longer, but now in stage 3, we start to see people not having as many babies. Why might that be? Well, it's because they're entering the workforce. We're starting to have forms of birth control. Women are becoming educated. They're going to school and getting jobs, and they're not staying home to have kids. Countries move to the stage when the birth rate drops. People are having fewer kids. Our population still tends to grow because the birth rate is higher, but it's just not as much. During stage 3, people are more likely to live in cities. They're having less kids. They don't need as many kids because they're not living on the farm and they don't need that workforce. Europe and North America moved to stage 3 at the first part of the 20th century. Latin America and Chile moved to stage 3 during the second half of the 20th century. And I don't know why I said Latin America and Chile. Oh, because other countries in South America haven't necessarily got there at the same pace. And then stage 4, where we have low growth. We've got a very low birth rate, low death rate, not really any increase rate. It actually might be decreasing. So we've got people in stage 4 that aren't having very many kids. They're not really dying in droves because we're developed and we have medicine and technologies and food that we can get to most people. So the population isn't really growing, but it's kind of dying off because if people aren't having as many kids, eventually the population gets smaller. And where we actually get into zero population growth, or ZPG. This is where the birth rate equals the death rate. So our increase rate approaches 0, meaning we're not growing in population. The CBR might be slightly higher, but some females die before childbearing. So that kind of balances it out. The fertility rate doesn't change the total population because we're just basically replacing each other. So it's really at about 2.1, which means there's really zero population growth. This is happening because more women are entering the labor force. They're working and they're not staying home. And we have access to a wide range of birth control, so we're not growing our population. For example, Denmark, instead of the classic pyramid with a wide fat bottom, Denmark, we've got more of a column shape, which is much more narrow. This is in stage 4, which shows the young and old population are pretty much the same because there's no growth. And we see that right here, narrow column of Denmark, where really we're just replacing our population. Back it up to a stage 3 country, we're seeing Chile, who's got the wider bottom, and it starts to slowly taper off here. But definitely Cape Verde, which is one of the poorest countries on the planet, we see that fat bottom where people are still having tons of kids, and they're not living quite as long. What's up with declining birth rates? Well, this occurs for a couple of reasons. Number one, it occurs through education. If you're in sub-Saharan Africa, there's not a lot of schools. Women aren't going to school. They're staying home and they're having lots of babies because we don't have birth control either. So because of these two reasons, contraception meaning birth control, we don't have ways to stop us from having babies, and we're not going to school. So in these areas where we don't have schools and we don't have contraception, we're going to have a lot of kids. As opposed to the United States, where equally, for the most part, we've got women going to school and getting jobs, and we've got available lots of forms of birth control. Thomas Malthus, speaking of overpopulation, he said in 1798 that population growth would overrun the food supply, meaning we're going to have too many people and we're not going to be able to feed them. He claimed that population increases geometrically and the food supply increases arithmetically. So as we increase across the globe, food supply would only increase in number. There's people that agree with him. They're called neo-Malthusians. They agree with Malthus, but think the situation is actually worse because we have so much more population in the recent years. They've seen population grow exponentially, and they say there's no way we can grow food for all these people. Now all countries have been in stage 2, where they've experienced lots of this growth and we have lots of technology, meaning people are living longer. So there's no way we can keep up. They see the world population growth is actually reducing resources, not just food population. And that's why it's worse, because it's not just food, it's oxygen in the air as we dump chlorofluorocarbons in and forms of petroleum that are dispersed in the air. We're cutting down the rainforest, we're reducing our oxygen levels. We're using up the available fresh water. So neo-Malthusians, they're worried about food and every other resource. But then there's also critics to Thomas Malthus. They consider that resources are expanding. Well, perhaps we're going to run out of oil. Well, critics say then the earth is always making more oil. Maybe not as fast, but we're still going to find more. They also say that the larger population is not something to be afraid of. It's something that actually stimulates the ability to grow more food. Because if you have one farmer, he can only grow a certain amount of food. But if you have 10 farmers, they can grow more food. So what we need to do is just share our resources. So Thomas Malthus, that's pretty big in geography, because he stated something that was to be a big concern for everyone on this earth. But there's a debate on how we've reached this equilibrium, on how we can provide food for everyone. Some people say, we've got to find a solution to all this huge population. Other people say, well, we kind of have fixed it. We're using genetically modified crops. We're using pesticides and herbicides and fertilizers that help us grow more, and different cultivating techniques to grow the food. But then again, other people say, well, those GMOs, they actually are damaging to the environment. So that's not good either. It's a fun debate. So in reality, population has grown, but food production has increased rapidly as well. Yes, people were worried about running out of food, but apparently we have the means to grow it. For example, in India, we have increased rice and wheat production, which occurred faster than the population grew because they used different growing techniques such as higher yield seeds and the cultivation of more land. Basically, they came up with seeds that they genetically enhanced, and they used more land, and they were able to feed their population. And you can see here on the graphic that rice and wheat went up further than the population. So the only concern would be, are genetically modified crops good, or do they do more damage down the line? We look at Japan, another example. In 2010, Japan had 127 million. It's estimated that by 2050, they're only going to have 95 million. So unlike the USA, Japan discourages immigration. So we're seeing their population actually decline. Here they are in 1950. They got a nice traditional pyramid shape. This is after World War II. So they've got a lot of people having babies. In 2010, though, we switch over and see that not that many people are having babies. We've got an older population that we've got to take care of as they get older, and our workforce is shrinking. This is projected here because Japan's like, okay, we're not letting any different people come in. We don't want immigration. So our population, younger years, is going to be very small. How are they going to take care of this aging population? That's a concern. As we look to the future, the demographic transition, we might see a possible stage 5 where we've gone beyond stage 4, which is very low growth, to an actual decline in population. Because if we have continued low birth rate, our older population begins to increase as they die. So it's actually going to start being negative. And when we look at countries like Russia, you're actually seeing a negative increase rate. So perhaps this is a good thing, because if we're worried about population on the planet, there wouldn't be as many people. But at the same time, we're like, well, we don't have a workforce that can take care of the older generation. Another concern there. China and India, these are the world's 2 most populous countries. You put them together and they add up 1/3 of the total population over all the earth. India, after 1947, this is after World War II, this is after the British Empire has left and they gained their independence, they start rapid growth. So they had so many people having babies there that they rapidly became overpopulated. So in 1952, they began a national family planning program where they utilized things such as birth control, abortions, and sterilizations. And of course, there's controversy with these last 2 here, but these are things that they have done to control what's going on because they are the 2nd most populated country. And the most populated is China. In 1980, they instigated the one-child policy, which prohibits marriage in people that are in their early 20s. They say they need to have a permit to have children, and they hand out freely contraceptives, which is birth control. They have free abortions and sterilizations. Again, their rationalization is that population is so large and people are having so many babies that they've got to come up with any means of taking care of that. Again, there's controversy with that. They're more relaxed now on these policies, but they still have a large payment that you must give if you want to have more than one child. What up with that? What up with that? No, just kidding. That was terrible. Sorry. In order to get into this, we look at the epidemiological transition. It kind of goes along with the demographic transition model. So there's specific things that happen in each stage of the demographic transition model. Epidemiology, this is the branch of medical science concerned with incidence, distribution, and control of diseases prevalent along a population at a specific time and are produced by some special causes, not generally present in the affected locality. So if we've got a population, what is it that's causing issues in each stage? These are things that don't generally happen in populations. These are unique, special situations which would cause death and people not to live as long. So we have the epidemiologic transition, where we look at distinctive health threats in each stage. Stage 1, we've got pestilence and famine, where you've got a very high death rate. The biggest one we think of is the Black Plague, which killed 25 million, or half the population of Europe, between the years 1347 and 1350. And a few years later, in 1380, it killed 13 million in China. So what was causing this enormously high death rate? It was a Black Plague. So this is going to be what you're looking at as far as the kind of things that are happening in stage 1, where people aren't generally living very long anyway. In stage 2, we're going to look at pandemics, where you've got people are dying, but it's declining. Like, not as many people are dying because we're still having a population growth. A pandemic is a disease that occurs over a wide geographic area and affects a very high percentage of the population. Cholera. This is the big one for AP Human Geography. You definitely want to know about the cholera outbreak, specifically in London, where it was mapped by Dr. John Snow in 1854. We're going to talk about how he solved the issue of cholera during this time, because you had a huge population in London and people were dying because of cholera. We move to stage 3, where you've got degenerative diseases. You start to see things that happen in people because the populations are living longer. You remember in stage 3, we're starting to see developed countries. People can live longer because of medicines and hospitals and technology. And because they're living longer, perhaps we're seeing these degenerative diseases come in because people are living longer. So there's other things that are going to kill them. They're not going to get the Black Plague. They're not going to be exposed maybe to pandemics because there's vaccinations and such. But now you've got things that are going to get them in old age, like cardiovascular disease, like heart attack. You've got cancers that come in populations with older people. And then stage 4, we have delayed degenerative diseases, where people live a long time, they've got cancer, but they're not going to die immediately because we've got the technology to extend their life. Here's a look into the stage 2 disease of cholera. This is London, specifically the Soho district, back in the 1850s. And Dr. John Snow, no, it's not Jon Snow from the Game of Thrones. Dr. John Snow, he was significant because he was a medical doctor, but he started to look at things in a geographic manner. He used GIS data to record cases of cholera in the Soho neighborhood. It was interesting because he found most of the cases with cholera were around the Broad Street pump, the water pump. And he deducted that the cholera is based in this pump here. And of course, people didn't believe him at the time because they're like, what? No, it's cholera. It's like people just get cholera. It's through the air or something like that. There's no way it could be in a pump. And so he begged the city to shut off this pump. And for a while, they wouldn't do it. And the only situation that was throwing him off was that he found a pump more north. And it could be this one here. But it was a pump that was more north, where there was a cholera victim, where someone had died because of cholera up at a northern pump. And it didn't make sense. The issue ended up being that this person lacked the taste of the water from the Broad Street pump. So while they were sick, or before they got sick, they had their sons or servants bring the water from the Broad Street pump all the way back to their house, even though they lived near a different pump. And that's why they had cholera, because they got it from the Broad Street pump. So eventually, they did have the city shut down the water pump right here, as it stands still to this day. That's always cool, where you see something that happened in history back in the 1850s. And then there's the same pump that was causing all the trouble right there. So they shut off that pump. Stage 2 pandemics. This is cholera. Where is it prevalent today? Well, we look back as the book was finishing up being published. This is the 11th edition here. So 2010, 2011, you've still got areas that are reporting outbreaks. And of course, we're looking at sub-Saharan Africa, where they don't have a lot of vaccinations, where they don't have the medicines, they don't have hospitals. So of course, we're going to see some outbreaks there. And you can see that cholera has diffused here and there to other countries. Well, where do people go? They're going to go to the United States, of course, because people immigrate. People from India, they're going to end up reaching people from China. Of course, if you've got a small population here in China, it's going to diffuse out. India, the situation is extremely populated. They are a developing country. They do have some infrastructure and technology, but you're still going to see in a mass population a problem with cholera. Stage 3, degenerative diseases, specifically cancer. And here we're looking at the male cancer death rate per 100,000 population. Where are we having the highest rate? In developed countries. This is Europe. Okay, well, you've got highly developed countries and people are living longer. You're seeing a population that's aging, and of course, they're not dying because of cholera. They're not dying because of the plague. They're dying because they're living older and they're getting cancers and such. But the other interesting thing to think about is, well, what else is going on in their population? Maybe they're eating processed foods because we're starting to use that, and even genetically modified crops. Does that cause problems with cancer in aging populations? Maybe. These are things that we think about as geographers. And then stage 4, the delayed degenerative diseases. Well, one of the big ones is obesity. Sure, we can keep people living a lot longer, but as we utilize things such as processed foods and fast foods and genetically modified crops, perhaps we're not getting as much nutrition, but we're getting more food, and we see populations getting very, very fat. So they're living a long time, but problems come along with it, such as obesity. And of course, we look at our good old United States of America here, where a lot of our diet has become the Western diet, where we eat steak, beef, specifically cheeseburgers, hamburgers, French fries, pizza, which is delicious, but we've got a problem. So these are the issues that come up with stage 4 countries. Infectious diseases. Well, could we see a stage 5 here? Maybe we see the return of infectious diseases, the return of parasitic diseases, where they're resistant strains, where we never actually wiped them all out. We can get crazy with conspiracy and think that maybe, there's a government somewhere that kept a resistant strain of some bug we killed off a long time ago, and they've got it hidden, and they're going to unleash it on the world. So maybe we're seeing a possible stage 5. You think about the polio vaccine. And if you look at maybe your parents or even people from countries like India, you have a little round circle on maybe your arm, up on your shoulder. I know my parents do, where they got the polio vaccine. So they're protected from polio. But I don't have that. My generation did not get the polio vaccine because we don't consider it a problem anymore in the United States. We wiped it out. We don't need it. But what if somehow it got reintegrated in the population? We would be in trouble because there's so many of us that are not vaccinated versus polio. We didn't get protected because we wiped it out. We don't need it. So we could see an interesting situation where we've got this stage 5, where we have these things coming back across the globe. The other problem is that through evolution, whether natural or otherwise, you've got bugs that have developed a resistance to drugs, because the ones that live, they multiply. And now we have a whole bunch of bugs perhaps that are resistant to things such as insecticides. So if we're concerned about malaria, which we are when we go to South America, maybe we won't be able to wipe out the new malaria-carrying bugs as they move up to the United States because they've become resistant to those drugs. Poverty is an issue because when we end up with unsanitary conditions and people can't afford drugs to treat themselves, we've got mass populations of people that could be exposed to things like tuberculosis. And when you think about countries like India, where you have this huge population, they're still a developing country, but they don't have the infrastructure or the money to treat everyone. Tuberculosis could be a problem. And then, of course, with increased connections, meaning people can travel everywhere across the globe in a matter of hours. If you're in sub-Saharan Africa and you pick up the Ebola virus, you could be in a developed country like the United States in a few hours. So things are spread by relocation diffusion rapidly, things like AIDS. Here we look at the diffusion of AIDS coming into the United States. Where are we seeing it the most? In the centers where people are entering. We've got Washington, D.C., New York City, these airports that are right here, flying into Miami, coming into Los Angeles and San Francisco on the West Coast. This is where you're going to see your most prevalent cases of AIDS as they come in. We look at the percentage of HIV positive people among the ages of 15 to 49 in 1990. You can see we've got a problem in sub-Saharan Africa. We fast forward to 2012, same age demographic, same age groups. You can see the diffusion of AIDS and as it spreads there. Healthcare. How do we know if countries are healthy? Well, excuse me. Well, we look at the infant mortality rate, IMR. This is the annual number of infants that die under 1 year of age. It's sad, but people have babies, but because of lack of healthcare, maybe those babies don't really live until even up to 1 year old. So that is an indicator of areas that might be more healthy. And we can see the entire Western Hemisphere has got a life expectancy, meaning people are going to live longer than in sub-Saharan Africa and even in parts of Asia. Life expectancy is the average number of years a newborn can expect to live. So in the United States, a newborn is expected to live to like 75 years or more. In South Africa, newborns, it's pretty low data. I mean, there's going to be a lot of newborn deaths and such. In Russia, we're going to be looking at the years. People are expected to live 60, 69 years, especially up here in Siberia. It's going to be a lot less chance to survive in areas that don't have much infrastructure or roads, hospitals, fire, and police protection. The provision of healthcare. Sure, maybe we do have healthcare, but how many people are getting it? In developed countries, we spend more money on healthcare because we have a higher population, but we also have a higher percentage of wealth that we use on healthcare. Meaning, we spend a lot of money on healthcare, but we also spend a larger percentage of our overall country wealth on healthcare because we've got the population that needs to be supported. So, for example, who's going to spend more money on healthcare, on hospitals and doctors and medicine research? Well, the developed countries, because they're going to take care of their populations. They're going to spend a lot of money. They have the money to spend, right? You look in Asia, they're not going to be spending lots of money on healthcare because they have massive populations. They're not as developed. They don't have the ability to cover their citizens. So you're going to see more deaths in these areas. You're going to see not as much coverage by healthcare. Medical services. You look at Europe, you're going to see the ratio of about 50 hospital beds and 30 doctors per 10,000 people. So people are covered by healthcare and medical services here, more than they are in sub-Saharan Africa, where you've got less than 20 hospital beds and fewer than 5 doctors per 10,000 people. That's the issue. It's not just do they have medicine. Another issue is, can you get that medicine? Where's the nearest hospital? And if you get to a hospital, it's probably going to be packed with a lot of people that are sick because they don't have the hospital beds. They don't have the doctors. Here's a consideration. Many European nations supplement healthcare, meaning they cover it in a lot of ways for their populations. In one sense, it's free. Certainly, they pay taxes for it, but in one sense, it's kind of free. Like they go there and the government supplements it. The problem is the public expense, the tax rate is very expensive. Switch over to the United States, where healthcare is privatized, meaning the government does not supplement it. Our healthcare is run by independent doctors and corporations. So on an individual level, if I go to the doctor, it's more expensive. Sure, I have insurance as a teacher, but it's more expensive to get healthcare, especially if we're getting into the services where you go beyond just seeing your doctor. The good thing is technology seems to be some of the best in the world, and we have access to it almost immediately. Like we're not really put on a waiting list where they are in like Africa and Canada, even where they supplement their healthcare through the government. So because they do that, everybody is waiting to get their tax-based free healthcare. It takes a while to get to it, and it's kind of expensive as far as taxes. In the United States, you can get access to your healthcare pretty darn quickly, but you're depending on insurance and you're paying for things yourself. Hello and welcome to AP Human Geography, Chapter 3, Key Issue 1, where we look at where are migrants distributed. One of the things that helps us understand where migrants move and why is the migration transition, which is the change in migration pattern in a society that results from the social and economic changes that also produce the demographic transition model. And if you remember, we looked at the demographic transition model where we see countries in stages where they're having high or low birth rates and a natural increase rate. So when we apply that same principle to migration, we see how immigration and emigration fits in. So for example, in stage 1, where we're seeing high birth rates, high death rates in the demographic transition, we're also seeing migration patterns where you have stage 1, basically just a high daily or seasonal mobility in search of food. Basically, people are migrating wherever they can to find food because they're not necessarily growing it themselves in stage 1. As we start to be developed as a society, we move into stage 2, where we've got a high birth rate and a rapidly declining death rate. This is the characteristics of populations in stage 2. As far as migration, what we start to see is we get high international immigration, meaning people are leaving their countries in search of a better life. But there's also interregional migration from rural areas of the country to the cities or urban areas. When we move into the demographic transition of stage 3, where we start to see rapidly declining birth rates and declining death rates, this is where we get high international immigration and intra-regional migration from cities to suburbs. So we're still seeing lots of international immigration, but the change is we're seeing migration going from the cities to the suburbs. In stage 2, we're seeing international migration where people are moving from the country to cities. In stage 3, we're seeing them go from the cities to a better lifestyle in the suburbs. Within stage 4, we remember that the birth rate is low and the death rate is low. So the situation is going to be the same as in stage 3. People are still going to be traveling internationally in search of jobs and a better life, but within the country, they're going to be leaving the cities to go to a better lifestyle in the suburbs. In stage 2, we see international migration. This is the most prevalent. In stage 3 and 4, we see internal migration where we're going from the cities to the suburbs. Distance of migration. Geographer G.E. Ravenstein created laws of migration, and two of the main ideas that you need to understand for AP Human Geography were that most migrants relocate a short distance and remain within the same country. The second principle was that long-distance migrants, they move to other countries, head to major centers of economic activity, usually cities. So most migrants, they stay within the same country and move around to find jobs. Most other migrants, when they travel long distances, they head to cities where they can find jobs and be with other people that are like them. There's two forms of migration: international migration, where it's a permanent move from one country to another, and internal migration within the same country. So within international migration, where you're moving permanently to another country, there's two forms of that. We've got voluntary migration, where the migrant chooses to move, and they're usually moving for economic improvement. They're going to find a better job or a job. And there's also forced migration, where the migrant is compelled to move through political or environmental factors. Like something is causing them to move. They don't really have a choice. Internal migration, migration within the same country permanently. You've got interregional migration, which is movement from one region of a country to another. So commonly we're seeing people move from the regions of the country to the region of the cities. And then there's also intra-regional migration, where it's movement within one region, where we see everybody's in like a large city area, but really they're just moving within that region, where they're going from the city to the suburbs. When we look at migration within Mexico, we can see that there's intra-regional migration, where people are moving within regions. And so they're going to maybe the poorer area to Chihuahua here, which is along the U.S. border, where they're going to have lots of work because factories from the U.S. like to set up right here. And so people will move to Chihuahua district to get jobs, but they will also do international migration, where they'll move from Mexico to the United States for jobs. International migration patterns. How are people moving across the earth? Well, the patterns that we see, the ones that are the most prevalent, are people moving from Asia to Europe. So this is separated here so you can get the idea, but here's Asia. And what we're seeing is people move to Europe in search of jobs and a better lifestyle. The other pattern is from Asia to North America. Again, looking for a better lifestyle, looking to get away from persecution, and looking for jobs in the United States. And the last pattern that is the most common is moving from Latin America to North America. When you consider the top three patterns, these are it: Asia to Europe, Asia to North America, and Latin America to North America. The interesting fact is that the United States has more foreign-born residents than any other country. So if you want to talk about the number one migration pattern, it's moving to the United States. U.S. immigration patterns. What have we seen over time in this country? Well, we have three different periods, and you can see those periods spiked out here along this graph. But the first period we look at is the colonial period during the 17th and 18th centuries. We know about this from middle school, studying it from history. These are when people come from Europe in a voluntary manner to relocate to start new lives in the New World. But we also see people from sub-Saharan Africa who are forced over here as slaves. So during the 17th and 18th centuries, this is when we're seeing a huge spike. So the 17th century, when is that? That's the 1600s. The 18th century, when is that? 1700s. Okay, so we're not even to that point yet. The second stage we see is mass European migration during the late 19th and 20th centuries. The situation we have going on there in the 1800s in Ireland and Germany is there's enormous economic and political unrest. And you think about in the 1850s, for middle school, you should know all about the potato famine in Ireland, which was the cause of huge economic downturn. And so people started to leave the country, coming to the United States. Something else in the European area during the 19th and 20th centuries was that in the late 1800s, people from Scandinavia began to come over because the Industrial Revolution diffused to Scandinavia. Scandinavia is in northern Europe and even northern Eastern Europe. So when you have the diffusion of the Industrial Revolution, it creates mass population explosions and overcrowding. So people leave Scandinavia as it diffused there in search of jobs in the United States. And in the 1900s, the early part of the 1900s, we see people from Southern and Eastern Europe starting to come to the United States because the Industrial Revolution diffused there. And the thing about it is, the Industrial Revolution did create lots of opportunity and jobs. But along with that, it created overpopulation, pollution, overcrowding, because everybody would move to those areas where they got the Industrial Revolution because they were looking for jobs. But it became so overwhelming that people were overcrowded, they were pushed out, and they were pulled to the opportunity and land in places like North America. And this is what you saw during the late 1800s and 1900s, which is where we see the spike right here. You think about the potato famine in Europe, there's where the spike starts to grow. And it continues all the way up into World War II when you see it really drop off. Then after World War II, it peaks back up because what we have coming in then is Asian and Latin American peoples in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. We have rapid population growth produces limited opportunities in those countries. So it's the same kind of thing. It just happened a little bit later. In Asia and Latin America, we've got population exploding. There's not enough opportunity in those countries. They know there's still land. They know there's still job opportunities in the United States. And so that's where we see that spike again after World War II. Do people migrate within a country? We'll look at our own country, interregional migration within the United States of America. And we consider the changing center of population. Remember, throughout the early part of our history, people were living here on the eastern seaboard, on the East Coast. And over the years, people migrated west. Let's take a look at how that pattern and why that pattern occurred. So in the 1790s, we've got colonial settlements near the coast. And people are pretty much staying all around here because they're blocked in by the mountains, the Smoky Mountains, the Appalachian Mountains. So during this time period, pretty much everyone's setting up along the coast because there's established settlements, and that's where the center of population is. In the 1800s to 1840, we start to see the population center move west, meaning there's still people living here along the coast, of course, but the average amount of people living starts to move west as we get better means of transportation. The big one is canals. Canals that are created open up the interior, and settlers learn to make use of all the trees in these areas, and they build their housing from that. Because certainly in the very beginning, people used log cabins to build their houses, but you would still see the type of construction with stones and such that you might find back in Europe along the coast, and you see that even today. But as people learn to make use of their surroundings, they use the canals and they open up the interior. So you start to see people crossing the Appalachians from the 1800s to the 1840s. Then in the 1850s to the 1890s, something happens. It's a gold rush in California. And what people did is they didn't settle in the interior. They skipped the middle and went all the way to California, which is way over here. But that still brought the center of population more west, even though they skipped the middle. The other reason they skipped the middle is because farmland wasn't accessible in the middle of the country because the topsoil, they didn't see it to be fertile. They didn't know how to use irrigation techniques at the time to bring in amounts of water, and they didn't have the plow to get just a little bit underneath the Great Plains topsoil. They actually called this area the Great American Desert. It was only a little bit later when they discovered, well, actually, with a few techniques, this could be the most fertile breadbasket of the world. But from the gold rush, we started to see that advances in agricultural technology in the 1900s and 1940s, where we did use the plow to access just a little bit below the topsoil in the Great Plains. We learned how to irrigate a little bit, and we did have the ability to grow food and settle into the middle of the continent, which brought the center of population even more west. And then from the 1950s to current times, we see job opportunities and warm climate opened up so much of the west. So not only does the center of population start moving west, it starts moving south with job opportunities in places like Texas and along the Gulf Coast. It starts to move south. When we think about internal migration, of course, we think of the Trail of Tears. In our history of the United States, it was a very sad moment where they forced Native Americans to migrate west after the law which was put in place called the 1930 Indian Removal Act, where you had people moving from southeastern United States to Oklahoma. During this time, you had more than 46,000 Native Americans uprooted, and many died along the way because they didn't do it in a very civil manner. They pretty much just marched them through terrible conditions all the way to Oklahoma. So we're seeing here a memorial at the start of the Trail of Tears in Chattanooga, Tennessee. Interregional migration in Russia. We looked at the United States. Now we're going to take a look at Russia, which for a time was pretty much our competitor, and it still is to a certain extent. We consider the United States to be the only superpower in the world, and yet we still look back at the history and we still have concerns about our competition with Russia. In any case, the Soviet government back in the day encouraged workers to relocate to areas such as Siberia in the far north to work in mines, factories, and construction sites near raw resources. And one of the situations with Russia is that they have so many resources. They got petroleum and minerals, silver and gold, and they've got a lot of it, but it's mostly up here in this region. And people don't necessarily want to go work there because it's a very harsh climate. So they would encourage people to move up here, but mostly they would leave because after one season, it was too harsh, it was too cold, it was too rugged and extreme. So another thing the Soviet government attempted to do was set up a program called Komsomol, where they had young volunteers who were usually in college to go work as volunteers in this area to support the government during their breaks from school, but that didn't really work out either. So Russia still struggles with getting a population of people up here to access their resources. We look at a few other countries where we have interregional migration, where we've got migration between regions. We've seen the United States and Russia, which were the two biggest land countries. Well, the other three biggest are Canada, China, and Brazil. Within China, we see people moving we'll look at China first because it's on this map. Within China, we see people moving from the rural areas of the west to the cities of the east to find work. And over this period, we've seen 100 million people move east, leaving their farm jobs to seek jobs in the cities of the coast. Within Canada, we looked at people during the same time as the United States. They're moving west because of the gold rush. So the center population in Canada pretty much echoes that of the United States. And in Brazil, it's pretty cool and different. What they did is they had so much population along the eastern seaboard, along their cities. Some of the largest cities in the world are Sao Paulo, Brazil, and Rio de Janeiro. Well, there was so much population, they needed more space. So they created the capital of Brasilia in the middle of their country, in the middle of the jungle in 1960. And we've seen the change in migration patterns in moving inward. And you can see the largest population growth today is in the orange, and it's in the middle of the continent, in the middle of the country. We also have intra-regional migration, where we have migration within the same region. The most common patterns are from rural to urban, from the country to the city, where people are looking for jobs. We also have urban to suburban, where people have lived in the cities and they want to get out to the suburbs where they can have a different lifestyle, where they can have a bigger yard, they can not be worried about their safety, there's less crime, and there's better schools traditionally. The other pattern is people moving from urban to rural, going all the way from the cities to the country. This is actually called counter-urbanization. Again, these people are doing it for a slower lifestyle. They want to not necessarily be caught up in traffic. They don't mind maybe growing their own food because they enjoy being outdoors in nature. So this is more prevalent today because we can still stay in contact. We can still run a business with technology, even though we're in the country. And you can see the net migration here, considering counter-urbanization of people leaving the cities going to the country. Where you've got a lot of growth is in areas that are traditionally thought of as in the country. Look, Colorado is seeing a lot of in-migration. People are moving into Colorado. That's not necessarily big city centers. Of course, you've got Denver, but not over here. This is people moving into the country. Wyoming, this is tons of just country. People are moving in because they want to counter-urbanize. They want to leave the cities for a different lifestyle. Why do people migrate? Reasons for migrating. We've got two. Either a push factor, which induces people to move out of their present location, meaning they're pushed out of their country, or a pull factor, which induces people to move into a new location, or it pulls them into a new country. Most commonly, we think of perhaps people were pushed out of Europe because they didn't have jobs, and they were pulled to the United States because they found jobs there. Three major types of push-pull factors are political, environmental, and economic. These are the reasons why people are moving. The most common one people move for are economic reasons. And you can see some migrants working low-income jobs here in Europe, and you can see where people are moving from. So percent that are foreign-born, when we're looking at Europe here, you have such a large percentage of foreign-born people have migrated to Spain. A lot of the reasons are for jobs and for the landscape. We looked at our push and pull reasons. Let's dig into the specific factors. Political is the first one we're going to consider. What are reasons people are politically being pushed or pulled from or to a country? The first one from history that's very common for us to think about is slavery, where people were forced out of their country. They were forced into slavery, or they were prisoners, and a lot of those came from sub-Saharan Africa. Other political push-pull factors is political conflict, where we've got wars going on, conflicts between groups of people. And there are terms in here that help us define if people are able to migrate or not, or if it's a political conflict or not. Refugee is one of the terms that is very important for seeing if a person is allowed to migrate into another country. Because if someone is deemed a refugee, this is classified as a person who is forced to migrate to another country to avoid the effects of armed conflict, situation of generalized violence, violation of human rights, or other disasters, and cannot return for fear of persecution because of race, religion, nationality, membership in a social group, or political opinion. So that's when someone leaves a country. An internally displaced person is someone who is forced to migrate for similar political reasons as a refugee, but has not migrated across an international border. So an IDP is basically someone who stays within their own country, although they've been forced out of their region. An asylum seeker is someone who migrated to another country hoping to be recognized as a refugee, but they don't yet have that status. So most recently, we think about refugees from Afghanistan and Iraq around the time period of 2010 because of all the violence and wars that were going in there. But most commonly, we think of Syria and all the situations going on there with the wars and the terrorism and people being forced out by all the chaos there. We look at the map of refugees as presented in 2012, and of course the biggest areas we see are Iraq and Afghanistan, where people are being forced out due to armed political conflict. This one shows green, as in people were leaving these countries going to Syria, but in 2015-16, we know that the refugee status in Syria is actually really, really bad. So this one should be deep purple as well, because people are leaving Syria. We talked about political push-pull factors. Now let's look at environmental push-pull factors. People are pulled to physically attractive regions. You think about Colorado and you have these beautiful mountains, or Florida where there's oceans and warm climates. People want to go there. Also in Europe, we're thinking about the Alps in eastern France. They're pushed from hazardous areas. For example, maybe they don't have enough water. There's a drought, so they can't grow crops. Or maybe there's too much water, such as flooding. As far as flooding, we look at this example here in Mississippi where houses were built along a floodplain. And one of the considerations from our text is to think about the 100-year floodplain, which is an area that typically gets built up and people don't even know it. They have their houses built there and they buy them not knowing that they're living within a 100-year floodplain, meaning every 100 years, this area is going to flood. And people just don't think about it because it's once every 100 years. So this is the Mississippi floodplain here, where you can see the path of the Mississippi River, but this is one of those situations where it flooded. Maybe it was once in 100 years, but all of these houses and developments are completely flooded. Opposite situation in Niger, where we've got drought, where they don't have any water in it. You can see this poor animal here has perished because there's no water. We've talked about political, we've talked about environmental, and now economically, what are the push and pull factors? The main one is job opportunities. Why do people leave a country? Mostly to search for jobs and opportunity in another country. We consider Ireland. They've had a long history of economic push and pull factors. In the 1850s, we specifically think about the Irish potato famine, which caused huge economic downturn. These dire economic conditions pushed people out of Ireland. But they caught back up in the 1990s, and their prosperity actually pulled migrants back in. But once again, in 2008, when we had the housing collapse, the economic trouble, there was not enough jobs in Ireland, and it began to force people out once again. Something that's very important to consider is if someone is an economic migrant or refugee. This distinction is important because some workers may be allowed to migrate temporarily for work. What I mean is, if you're a refugee, you are recognized by many countries as seeking asylum, seeking refugee status, where you can move and live there permanently. Economic migrants are not seen as the same status as a refugee. Economic migrants are looked at as people that are just looking for a job. People tend to be more understanding of refugees because of the incredible turmoil and political instability they're having to overcome. Economic migrant, people have less sympathy for because they're thinking, well, they just need a job. So it's very important if you're looking to migrate to be seen as a refugee because that gives you more opportunity to migrate. But within the economic migrant status, we have the term of guest worker. This is where you have immigrants from poor countries that are allowed to temporarily obtain jobs. And you saw this all over Europe. But these programs no longer exist because many immigrants took advantage of the situation and they just stayed there. They didn't leave when they were supposed to. And in the end, they ended up bringing their families and added to the population problems in Europe. Europe's migrant workers. When we think of the jobs that are taken care of by the citizens that are doing the primary and secondary jobs where they're working in mines and factories, these typically come from the poorer regions of Europe in the south and east because they don't have these opportunities in those places in Europe and even the Middle East. Asia's migrant workers. Let's look at China. On the west of China, there's very many poor regions where people are just poor farmers and they don't have a lot of opportunity. They are migrating to the job centers in the cities. Specifically, consider Southwest Asia. You've got wealthy oil-producing countries. And they have now become destinations for work. So lots of people are pouring in there. So within Asia, you have people going in and out and staying within regions. Hello and welcome to Chapter 3, Key Issue 4. Why do migrants face obstacles? What keeps people from being able to move? Well, these obstacles, they're called intervening obstacles. It's when you have an environmental or political feature that hinders migration, something that stops you from being able to move. Traditionally, the obstacle was the environment. For example, if you had a long journey, you might have to cross an ocean or mountains, and we didn't have the infrastructure to get you through those conditions very quickly. Maybe there was a very cramped scenario where you're on a ship for weeks or months at a time. So your obstacle was the distance. Today, the obstacles are more political, like borders. What's going to keep you out legally? So, for example, we look at Tijuana, Mexico, and San Diego. Here's Mexico over here. Here's the USA. And you can see that this border is backed all the way up into Mexico for a distance here because people are waiting to get through the border to immigrate into the United States of America. Another obstacle for immigrants is quota laws. Quota is something that sets maximum limits on the number of people who can immigrate to the U.S. during a year. So back in the 17, 18, earliest 1900s, there was no quota laws. Anybody who wanted to move to the United States, you just come on in. Well, in 1921, they initiated the Quota Act and the National Origins Act in 1924, and it limited people. It became an intervening obstacle. So this is the first legal action to limit people coming into the country. And basically, it was designed to allow people of European descent to come into the country, but it was meant to keep out people from other regions because they were used to people of similar backgrounds being in the United States, but they didn't necessarily want people who were different to come in. And over the years, you can see how this kind of changed. For example, in 1965, they changed it from quotas for certain regions, but then they replaced it with hemisphere quotas. And even that, though was still biased because you see how they allowed in 170,000 people from the Eastern Hemisphere and only 120,000 from the Western Hemisphere, meaning Latin Americans would have been limited as opposed to other people. In 1978, they changed it to just a straight up top quota of 290,000 people, 20,000 max per country. So it was a lot more even. And then in 1990, they just raised it to a global quota, 700,000 people from any country, for all countries total. However, this quota, keep in mind, does not apply to refugees because as a refugee, you can get in and your number does not count. And there's also preferences to who gets in first. For example, if you are applying to be an immigrant to the United States and you already have family that lives in the United States, you're going to get preference because they want to reunify your family. Another thing is if you're a skilled worker, you're going to have a much better chance of getting into the United States because your skills could be used here. They're more likely to bring in a doctor than to allow in someone who doesn't really have any skills and would work maybe in lawn care. And then diversity. The interesting thing is, maybe you are a doctor, but you're from a white European country, and maybe they're saying, well, we need more diversity, so we're going to let a doctor in from India, for example. So these are the parameters and things that they're thinking about when we set up the quota acts. What we look at are two things about migrants coming into the United States. One of them is brain drain. What we mean is we're getting a whole bunch of very intelligent, highly skilled people that are leaving a country. So, for example, if you are a country in Asia, but all of your smart, talented, and skilled people are leaving to the United States because they're finding better job opportunities and more money there. What we're creating is a situation of brain drain because your population is not gaining the benefit of the smart, skilled, and talented people. Literally, you're draining your brain power of your country. The other thing we look at is chain migration. When we see international migrants move between countries, we usually see a situation where they all end up in a very similar area together. Because doesn't it make sense that people who are relatives want to live near each other if you're coming to a completely new country? Or if you're all Chinese, it makes sense that naturally you would all want to locate in the similar areas. So that makes sense. If you were traveling across the earth, wouldn't you want to link up with people who are like-minded or similar to you, who've been from the same country because they have the same experience? Ellis Island. This is a unique situation where during a certain time period, 1892 to 1954 in New York Harbor, we had 12 million immigrants came through this facility to immigrate to the United States. It's not there. It's not in use anymore. It is there as a monument, but it's not in use anymore. And it wasn't in use before the 1890s. Most of these people coming through Ellis Island down here, they were from Europe. The thing is, even if you made it all the way across the ocean, the people who are running Ellis Island, they still might turn you away. Like you would have to leave and go all the way back on your ship. And it was miserable conditions on the ship. Sometimes it took 2 weeks. Sometimes it took 2 months. It just depended. And you could be in cramped quarters. And imagine getting all the way over to the United States and being turned around at Ellis Island saying you have to go back. The reasons why they were turned around is because sometimes they wanted to ask if you had a job. If you had a job lined up, cool, you're able to take care of yourself financially and you wouldn't become a burden to the United States. If you didn't have a job, they might send you back. They wanted to know if you had family that already lived in the United States. If not, they might send you back if you're nobody with no connections. And certainly, they checked for diseases like trachoma, which is an eye disease. And if you had those, they would send you all the way back. So a lot of the times, family members would get separated. They might let in 4 members of your family, and you, being the father, perhaps, you didn't get in because maybe you had trachoma, an eye disease, or maybe you didn't have enough money. They send you all the way back. So it was a situation where if you had family that already lived in New York, when they greeted you after you made it through New York Island, it was tears of joy, or it could have been tears of extreme despair and sadness as they sent you back. Fun fact that Rubenstein presents in his textbook. There was debate for years who actually owned Ellis Island. The Supreme Court decided in 1998 that New York owns the original island, but gave the expanded lands around the island to New Jersey. So here's Manhattan, New York, and they own the actual original island here. But New Jersey is another state right here. It claims to have owned the new additions to the island that they built up over time. And it stands today. Unauthorized immigration. This is where we have immigrants entering a country without proper documents. In the United States, there are 11.2 million unauthorized immigrants as of 2010, according to the Pew Hispanic Center. 58% of these unauthorized immigrants are from Mexico. The rest are from other Latin American countries and countries around the globe. 1 million of these are children. That's a lot. Think about that. 1 million are children. They came over illegally, unauthorized. However, if you have a parent that comes over to the United States and a child is born, they're automatically citizens. So that becomes a problem as well because you have people who are unauthorized, and yet their children, however many of them, they become full U.S. citizens. So over time, you can see how that population of people gains influence. What they're also noticing is that the duration of stay of immigrants has increased over the years. They don't just stay and work a little bit and go back more and more. They just stay. 8 million of these unauthorized immigrants are employed in the U.S., which creates 5% of the total U.S. civilian labor force. So 5% of our entire population is unauthorized immigrants. These immigrants, they work in mainly blue-collar jobs, such as construction and hospitality, jobs that typically people in this country think of as not wanting to do because we go traditionally for more things like teachers and lawyers and doctors and technicians. So there's benefits and drawbacks to allowing immigrants to come in to work the jobs that maybe we don't want. The largest places where you're seeing unauthorized immigration is California and Texas. Let's think about it. They're right there on the borders. Mexico's border, it is 1,951 miles long, going all the way across the southwestern portion of the United States. The thing is, the Berry Wall covers only 1/4 of the border. That's not very much. It's just 25% of this entire landmass that you see, all of North America, except which gets cut off by the Gulf of Mexico. This border, it runs through sparsely inhabited regions where there's not very many people. If you're out here in the desert, or out here in the desert, there's not a lot of people that are going to watch over the border. And in a lot of cases, there's no wall at all. It's just open desert. So the border in rural areas and small towns is guarded by only a handful of agents because, let's face it, that's a long border. There's a lot of money that has to go into protecting the border. And you end up with a situation that looks like this. Tecate, Mexico, and California. Here's USA, California. Here's Mexico. I mean, it's not going to take much to get over the border, really. Characteristics of immigrants in the USA. Well, when we look at what Ravenstein said in his characteristics of migrants, he says that most are long-distance migrants, and they're male. Because if you're traveling a long ways, you're going for work, and most jobs traditionally have been done by men. Over the course of history, that's changed, but Ravenstein's characteristics were that it was male who were traveling long distances, and the other thing is they're usually adult individuals, so male adult individuals, traditionally. However, what we see in the United States is 40% are young adults from ages 25 to 39. That makes sense, right? Because they're the ones that are able to travel and work the jobs. Of course, immigrants are less likely to be elderly people. They're going to be too old to work, too old to travel, too old to take risks, really. But now more immigrants are coming over with their mothers. Families are coming over. And the characteristics is that recent immigrants have attended less school, so they're not as educated as people are in the United States. They're coming over to find the jobs and work the jobs that the educated populations of the United States are not necessarily wanting to work. So the change that has happened is the gender of the migrants. It used to be that it was young working class males that come over, but as of 1990, what Rubenstein and his research has found is that it's more female now. We've had populations of males coming over here. Now it's switched over to the females who have come to catch up with their male counterparts, but also gender roles have changed in the United States and in Mexico to where it's not necessarily females to stay home and watch over the kids and have babies and work in the home. They're workers as well, and that's why it's swapped. Concerns about immigrants in the USA. You got Americans who are divided on the benefits and drawbacks of immigration. Because as we said, in the workplace, these immigrants come in to fill jobs that potentially nobody wants. Let's face it, who wants to grow up to be in the lawn care jobs? Well, it doesn't seem like very many do. But we do want our lawns mowed, right? So we need someone to do it. So it's benefits and drawbacks of the workplace. Border patrols. The concern is, do we need more border patrols? Do we need more security on the border? Do we want to keep unauthorized immigrants from getting in? That's a concern to a lot of people. On the one hand, we cherish the diversity of immigration. This is a country of immigrants here in the United States. On the other hand, we want to be safe, and we want to make sure we have enough jobs for the people who are already here. Civil rights. You think about the state of Arizona, who came up with a law where it's totally okay to pull people over if they look like an illegal immigrant. And on the one hand, you're like, well, we want to be safe, so let's check and make sure that everyone is legally in the right place. But at the other perspective, We're United States citizens. We thrive. We have fought for our history to be free so that we don't have police forces and government agencies pulling us over at random to check on who we are. And then local initiatives. A lot of people feel like the borders is a federal responsibility or a national responsibility, and some people feel like it's local. So these are all concerns that we talk about in human geography, which is why I love this class. Immigration concerns in Europe. Sources of people migrating in Europe typically come from Southeastern and Eastern Europe, where you've got these Eastern and Southeastern European countries and Middle Eastern countries that don't have the job opportunities, that are coming in the masses to Western Europe where they have the development and the jobs. Opponents to immigration in Europe are similar to what we have in the United States. People don't want their traditions and cultures to be threatened. Europe is traditionally white, and they have their backgrounds, and they don't necessarily want people from Eastern European and Middle Eastern traditions coming in to change their culture and speak different languages and have different religions. I mean, you think about chain migration from migrants coming to the United States, they want to be with people who are similar. Well, it's the same situation here in Europe. They feel threatened. They see crime go up, perhaps, with immigration. They don't want people coming in and living off the welfare of the state and having to pay more taxes because of that. And if there is a situation of unemployment, they don't want immigrants coming in and taking the jobs in the first place. So it's similar to what we're seeing in the United States. The interesting point is that Europeans, throughout history, have brought their culture across the earth. It's spread out, it's diffused across the earth, specifically to North America. So just like the United States, Europe is concerned about the immigration situation, but at the same time, they were immigrants throughout history and spread their culture elsewhere as well. So it's a really interesting dynamic. I know a lot of us want to preserve our safety and our culture. At the same time, we're immigrants ourselves. Our families have come over to the United States before us, and we thrive on the principle of the Statue of Liberty that says, give us your tired, your poor, your huddled masses. We want to bring people in and welcome them. What's the proper balance? I don't have that answer, but those are things we talk about in AP Human Geography. Distributed from the Rubenstein textbook. I'm Andrew Patterson. So elements of culture. What makes up a society and what do they do that makes them unique? Two aspects: daily necessities of a group of people, how they obtain food, clothing, and shelter, and their leisure activities. When they're not working, what arts are they creating? What are they doing for recreation? As geographers, we examine how culture influences behavior. Put all these together and we see unique locations across the globe. If you're an individual, you might find that you have certain habits or repetitive acts. For example, do you bite your fingernails? Maybe that's a bad habit. Or before every test, maybe you use a certain pen. Maybe that is your habit as an individual. A custom, a repetitive act that a group works on together. This is when a habit becomes a custom for a group of people. So what is the custom of the people in Texas? Maybe we greet each other by saying howdy. I mean, obviously that's not the case anymore, but that could be one of our customs. Within culture, we specifically look at material culture, which is a collection of social customs. So for example, maybe it's customary for youth going to high school to wear jeans in the United States. What is the material culture? And a lot of the ways it helps me remember that, I'm thinking about the tangible objects, the materials that make up their culture. So in this situation, it would be jeans. Folk and pop culture. First thing we look at is the hearth, or the center of an innovation. Where did everything originate from? Within folk culture, sometimes it's hard to know where the origin is, where the hearth is, because it originates in an unknown place, because it goes back way into history. We don't know where lots of folk culture traditions began because we don't know. It wasn't recorded history. But folk culture is small scale. It's transmitted by relocation diffusion slowly over time. It really doesn't diffuse rapidly because it's normally isolated small groups of people. In contrast, popular culture is a product of developed countries that have a lot of influence, that have a lot of materials. Popular culture origins are traceable to a specific person or place because we know that moment in time where their idea exploded and it became popular for everyone. One example was the creation of pop music in the 1900s in the United States, where you had the music industry. It went from people just playing music for small groups and churches and such to it being created for mass populations of people, specifically in Tin Pan Alley in New York City, where producers would create music to sell so that thousands, mass populations of people could hear the music and they could make money off of it. Popular culture. Other things we think of as jeans, iPods, t-shirts, pizza. These are items that have diffused across the world because they're so popular. They're made for the masses. It diffuses rapidly and hierarchically. What we mean is typically it stays within a certain level of people and diffuses across the globe. That's what hierarchically means. Popular culture is distributed widely, and the only limitations are perhaps by a lack of income. Because if Air Jordan shoes are part of pop culture, our limitations are, well, people in developing countries possibly can't afford it. Folk culture. How it remains, why it's so unique, is we look at the isolation of the Himalayan folk culture as an example. This is we're studying the painting. Each of these cultures creates paintings, but within this 1,500-mile corridor here in Bhutan, Nepal, India, and Tibet, it's interesting because there's so many unique and varied styles that you'll find. For example, Buddhists in the north, they paint idealized divine figures, like this right here. Hindus in the south paint scenes from everyday life, sometimes with a deity. You can see everyday life. There's a guy riding his horse, and there's the elephant right there. Muslims in the west paint flowers and plants, but are prohibited from displaying animate objects in art. So this is why you're seeing some pretty clear images, but there's nothing alive. Like there's no people in their art. And the animists, they're in the southeast and they paint symbols and designs about their religion. Again, this is folk culture because we have paintings. We have a small, relatively across the earth, a small area right here. But because these people are isolated in the mountains, their paintings developed in a unique way. You should be able to know where you are in this area based on the type of paintings. That's what you can do with folk culture. Folk culture and music. In its earliest origins, some examples we look at here, and it developed in other places across the earth too, but some early examples of folk music origins. China, in 2697 BC, the Emperor Huang Ti sent Ling Lun to cut bamboo poles that sounded like the call of the phoenix. So in China, they try to recreate some sounds and come up with music which they can play over reeds. In Vietnam, another folk tradition is that stories were told through song about planting seeds in winter and summer, and what were the best practices for that. So here's two examples of specific locations where folk music came from. And this wasn't created for the masses, it was for individual peoples and tribes and areas that did not spread across the globe. Then, like we were saying earlier, popular music explodes internationally because it's written to be sold and for a large number of people. We talked about Tin Pan Alley in the early 1900s where people were selling the music. From there, popular music expanded, especially from Western or United States, through the Armed Forces Radio Network. So after World War II and during, the armed forces have their radio network where they're playing popular songs from the United States. Well, the United States is in so many places across the globe during this time because we're fighting all over the world. And that network diffuses popular music everywhere on Earth. And finally, we find popular music influenced by African folk music, Western dance music, techno, from the United States to Europe, where you can certainly see in the beginning that you get some influence of traditional African music, and it diffuses over to some more isolated places. But once that traditional African folk music gets picked up and combined with aspects, one of them being the techno music, it gets sent globally because it's created for the masses and it spreads very rapidly. Popular sports. Well, they had sports and folk culture, but it didn't really go around the globe. So the one we always think about is soccer, because this is the most popular worldwide sport. In the 11th century, English workers began to kick around a Danish soldier's head, creating the game called Kick the Dane's Head. And there's a couple ways the stories go, but sometimes it's soldiers that we understood started the game, and sometimes it's workers that were working on this castle area later. In any case, it's a group of Danish soldiers or Danish people. They begin to, it's a group of English workers or soldiers begin to kick around their rivals, the Danes, one of their heads, and it becomes a little game. So instead of some guy's head, eventually they start to use a cow's bladder, and then finally villages do start to pick up on this trend, but they're spending their time not working, they're playing soccer, so the king bans it all the way up till 1603. Then, over time, it becomes a popular culture sport. What happens is it goes from just being a game that small, isolated villages and groups of people play to a recreational sport where clubs form and people start to get very skilled at the game in the 1800s. Leisure activity comes around. It's created for people working in factories to give them something to do other than go home and drink beer. This became a subject that was taught in schools, so it begins to spread more rapidly. As people had more time, as incomes go up, people began to pay to see professionals who were very skilled at the game. This becomes one of their leisure activities. The British Empire, as it begins to fuse around the world, because they started to have influence, where they said at one time the sun never sets on the British Empire because it went all the way around the globe. Everywhere they went, they took the game of football or soccer. And then on top of that, when TV came around, the entire world had access to at least viewing soccer, and it was definitely a popular culture sport. Another sport that's in pop culture is the Olympics. Consider that to be included in the Olympics, a sport must be played in at least 75 countries on 4 continents. That's a whole bunch of people playing your sport. So, for example, Taekwondo, pretty much everyone across the globe has that sport in their country. But sports that are not included, that are popular in the United States, would be football or American football and baseball. At one time, baseball was in the Olympics, but they dropped it in the last few years. So in 2016, we expect to see, because this video is coming out before the Olympics, there should be 28 sports in the Olympics. Looking at our World Cup qualifying countries over the years in soccer, who's got the most? Well, you can see where it's diffused. You've got Brazil, Argentina, and then countries in Europe. Of course, USA, we're still developing. We developed later with soccer. It's just now becoming a super popular sport like football and baseball. Well, then we've got some folk sports that are still surviving. It's not played all over the earth, but they remain. Cricket, which we know is popular in the United Kingdom and the former British colonies, wherever the United Kingdom spread their influence. Wushu, which is a martial arts that combines kicking, jumping, wrestling, and jumping with combat. It hasn't spread across the globe. It still remains a folk sport. Baseball, of course, it's very popular in the United States and even Japan, because after World War II, the United States soldiers introduced the Japanese to baseball and it became very big there. But other than those two countries, it's not so big across the globe. A lot of places in Latin America it is, but baseball still remains a folk sport because it's not global. And Australian rules football. It's a very distinctive form of soccer and American football that is limited mostly just to Australia. And you can see, well, you should be able to see this. It looks more like a football, but it's kind of yellow, and it's kind of like soccer, but they're carrying it and tackling each other like in football. So those sports survive. Let's look at key issue 1. Folk and pop culture. As far as clothing, we've got folk clothing, where it's created because it fits in with how they live. It's used for agricultural practices and environmental conditions, because people throughout history had to grow their populations based on the materials they had in the physical environments where they were located. Consider specific examples of the Netherlands, where they wear wooden shoes. Netherlands is a historically low-lying area where they've actually built land that's below sea level, and they have dikes and levees that hold the seawater back, but it floods a lot. It's low-lying, so any water they get there is going to cover a lot of ground. So they traditionally wear wooden shoes so they can keep their feet dry, because you're not going to want to wear canvas or tennis shoes because they're going to be soaking wet. Of course, you go up to where it's cold in the Arctic, they're wearing fur-lined boots. Maybe if you're in a warm climate on the beaches or in the tropics, you're not wearing shoes at all. This folk clothing, the thing about it is, it can seem to be kind of controversial if you're wearing your folk garb in popular culture. You know, today in society, when you're walking down the street in the United States, everybody's wearing jeans, t-shirt, tennis shoes. But if you maybe want to honor your culture and you wear some of that clothing, like what if this guy walked down the street in the United States with his wooden shoes, people would really find him out of place. And so it becomes tough to honor your folk clothing traditions. Pop clothing, on the other hand, it's reflective of your occupations. If you are in business in the United States or the Western society, you're going to be wearing the Western business suit, tie for men, nice dress and slacks for women, perhaps. Pop clothing can be based on income. Of course, lots of people wanted Air Jordan shoes, high tops. When I was growing up, it was ridiculous. That's when they first came out in the 1980s and 90s. And if you couldn't afford them, those kind of shoes, which I couldn't, then you're not going to be able to get that clothing, because popular culture is sold for a profit and it can be high dollar. So if you can't afford it, then your income limits you. Pop clothing is spread rapidly through global communication. Nowadays, we can take a picture of something on our phone and send it on the internet, and everybody sees it across the globe. So something that's popular is going to spread very, very fast, as opposed to traditional garb like wooden shoes, because it's not made for the masses. It's made for individuals in certain specific, unique locations. Pop clothing is created for the masses. They make it so it catches on and it sells to a whole bunch of people. Folk food preferences. Why do folk cultures eat certain foods? When you go to a certain location, why do they have very specific, unique foods? Well, a lot of the times it's affected by what's available, and it's influenced by cultural traditions. Some examples. The Apipone of Paraguay, they eat jaguars, stags, and bulls to make them strong, brave, and swift. This is what they think. But hens or tortoises will make them cowardly. So you wonder, why do the Apipone of Paraguay eat these things? Well, because over the course of time, they saw people eating jaguars and stags and bulls, and maybe they had a great performance, they seemed stronger, they were able to hunt more, and so they thought, okay, well, these things will make them strong. And then as far as hens and tortoises, maybe somebody over the course of time, they ate a tortoise, a turtle, and it just made them kind of weak and cowardly. So that's how these things get started. The Ainu of Japan avoid otter because they're forgetful. That makes sense, right? If you look at an otter that maybe seems like they don't know what they're doing, hey, maybe we avoid that. Or someone ate otter, and then down the line that person became forgetful. Makes sense that maybe they're going to avoid that certain type of food. The Mkapau women don't eat chicken or goat during pregnancy because they believe it reduces labor pain. So somewhere down the line, people ate chicken and goat maybe before giving birth and had a horrible, horrible time. So they're like, okay, what was the problem? Well, she did eat chicken and goat before she gave birth, so she had a horrible time. So I'm going to avoid that. The Istanbul diet is full of fresh vegetables because the city has many small gardens called bostons, and you can see that reflected here. So if you go to Istanbul and you're like, wow, why don't they have cheeseburgers and french fries all over the place? Why do they eat fresh vegetables in Istanbul? Well, over the course of their history, they planted small gardens all throughout their city to sustain themselves. Because when the city came under attack, if they had gardens outside the city walls, of course they couldn't get food. So to combat this, they just grew those gardens in small plots inside the city. So they could still raise food even while they're under attack. So this is why that developed. This is why that remains part of their diet to this day. Taboos. A restriction on behavior imposed by social custom. Something they think of as bad. Ooh, that's taboo. Well, the Hebrews are prohibited from eating animals that do not chew their cud or have cloven feet, and fish lacking fins or scales. So they're not going to eat, pigs? Muslims don't eat pork because perhaps they are not suited for dry lands in the Arabian Peninsula and would compete for water. Now, this is a Rubenstein text thought process here. Why do Muslims eat pork? Well, it's against their religion. One of the thoughts maybe is because they compete for water in dry lands and pigs don't really fit well. That's just Rubenstein's thought there. Hindus don't eat cows because they're based on sacred tradition of reincarnation, and they think that if you die, you are reincarnated, and one of the things you can become is a cow. And so they don't want to eat someone who could have been in another life, their friend or family member, so they're not going to eat cows. So these things are seen as taboos. Popular food culture. These pop food preferences are influenced mostly by cultural values. So we look at the differences among countries here. So which country prefers more of Coca-Cola or which prefers Pepsi? Well, in the Western Hemisphere, except for Quebec, Coca-Cola leads. But in Quebec, Pepsi leads because they successfully had a lot of propaganda, commercials, and promotions. That said that French-Canadian culture really tied in well to Pepsi. So Pepsi leads in Quebec over here, whereas other places it's Coke. Soviet Russia had Pepsi, but with the fall of communism, they switched to Coke to get away with the association of failed government. But also it's because when it was communist in Soviet Russia over here, and they were using Pepsi, they would see in a limited basis, U.S. kids on the limited amounts of television they had access to back then, U.S. youth being free and driving around in convertibles in cars, and they could do whatever they want, and they were wearing jeans and drinking Coke. These guys were drinking Pepsi. So when the wall fell and Russia became more of a democracy, they switched over to Coke because they wanted a new statement. They wanted to feel what they thought of was freedom in the United States. The Muslim countries in Southwest Asia, they have boycotted Coke because it was sold in Israel, which they're always in competition with. So Pepsi is preferred in these Southwest Asian Muslim countries. Then we look at regional differences within the United States. Dunkin' Donuts, they like in the Northeast, as opposed to Krispy Kreme in the Southwest. White Castle up in the Midwest, or In-N-Out Burger in the Southwest. I think we have In-N-Out Burger here in Texas. But growing up, we had White Castle over here. We didn't have anything like In-N-Out Burger. Wine is preferred in California because they have the best grapes there. But in the Midwest, we've got beer and spirits because so much grain is grown in this area. And that's what you use to make beer and things like vodka and whiskey. Pork rinds in the South is preferred because that's where they have a bunch of pig farms. And popcorn and potato chips in the North because they have those kind of grains. Now, that to me sounds a little bit of overboard assumptions there and things in general. But, Rubenstein does a good job of trying to reason and group things together so that's easier for us to grasp. Wine production. Well, there's environmental factors that go into it. Number one is the climate. Temperate climates with modern winter and hot and sunny summer tend to be the best places to grow wine. So if you're looking for where that might be, of course, we're looking over here in the temperate Mediterranean climate, of course, and over in California. The topography for growing wine, it usually is best when you have hillsides that maximize sunlight exposure, but also you can drain it well. So in hilly California, that's perfect as well, as opposed to, at the same time with the Mediterranean. Then, of course, soil. Soil that is coarse and well-drained is great for growing grapes, but also cultural factors. Wine seems to be grown in locations with traditions of excellence, where people like to drink it and where people can afford it. Where do you find that? In wine country and in Napa Valley. And it's really dominated by Christian countries. And you don't really find great wine growing where it's discouraged by Hindu and Muslim countries because they don't drink wine in these areas, right? Folk housing. Environmental influences. Why did they create these houses? Why do they look the way they do? Well, pitched roofs become pretty important in areas that are super rainy or snowy because you want it to be able to come off of your roof. You don't want a flat roof because that would just sit there and catch water and pile up on the snow and then it would collapse. Environmental influences. Windows. Maybe we want them to face the sun so we can get some heat in there. Or you know what? If we're in Texas, maybe we don't want our windows to face the sun because then it stays hot inside all day long. Wood. If our house has wood on it, it's probably because we could easily access lots of timber, lots of trees. If our house has brick, we probably don't have a lot of wood around. There's not very many trees. So we use the brick or the clay from what's available in the dirt right there, baking it in the hot sun in dry climates. Stone was common in Europe and in South America because it's easily accessible in formats that they're not having to carve out. We get specific here. In Chinese villages, we're looking at folk housing. Kashgar, this city, they utilize second floor, open air patios to catch evening breezes. And you can see that over here. with patios that are open to the breezes. In Turpan, you have small open courtyards for social gatherings, no second story patio because high winds. So you walk to the city in China called Turpan and you're like, wonder why this house looks like this as opposed to in this city the houses look like this. Well, we just told you. They want open air breezes here in Kashgar. And in Turpan, they want to be social with their open courtyards. We'd love to have a second story, but the winds are too high. In Incheon, they have large open air courtyards with tall trees for shade. So it's similar to Turpan, but a little bit different. And then in Dongguan, they have walled courtyards covered with lattice to create shade, but they allow airflow as well. So these are just the regional differences based on the environmental influences. Sacred spaces in folk housing. Well, if you go to the island of Java, their front door always faces south because they're looking toward or welcoming the South Sea goddess who holds the key to the earth. And it sounds silly, but if you are one to ask the question, why is every house facing south? Traditionally, that's why it developed like that. On the island of Fiji, the eastern wall is considered sacred. So if you're wandering around in their house and you happen to lean up against it, you might want to be careful and keep that in mind. Why? Because it's sacred. In China, the northwestern wall is considered sacred in parts of China. Madagascar, you got various things here. Well, the main door is always on the west. The northeastern corner is most sacred. If you're an important guest, you're going to enter from the north and be seated against the northern wall. And your bed is placed against the eastern wall with your head facing the north. Seems like a lot of guidelines. But these are folk traditions that are isolated, not created for the masses. They've developed over time in small, isolated regions for specific reasons. In Laos, our beds are arranged perpendicular to the center ridgepole of the house, unless you're a child with a house next to your parents. Then your head is going to be towards the parents' feet as a sign of obedience. And sure, these are kind of like facts that you're probably never going to remember, but how neat is that to go into a culture and figure out, wow, that's so cool that they have little parameters and interesting facts about them that make their culture unique as far as the ways where they place their head. I love our culture here in the United States, but at the same time, it's like, hey, which way is your bed facing? We're just like, just whatever way we want. So on one hand, that's really cool, like, whatever way we want. On the other hand, it's like, well, what's unique about that? Well, maybe it's unique because we can do whatever we want. But it's also cool to see these different parameters here of these cultures that are isolated. We finish it off with Thailand, who's got the Yuan and Shan people who sleep with their heads all facing east, which is important to the Buddhists, and staircases must not face the west because that's the direction of death and evil spirits. Fun little tidbits to know about different cultures. U.S. housing. Well, we talk about other cultures. What does it look like in the United States? U.S. folk housing is in 3 different areas. We've got New England, Mid-Atlantic, and Lower Chesapeake Tidewater. You will find the different diffusions of very similar types of folk housing in these 3 areas. And we're not going to get into that today, but you need to know that because Rubenstein likes to question on that, and it definitely is good for understanding that there was 3 different distinct folk areas on the eastern seaboard, the east coast of the United States. As far as popular housing goes, there's definitely regional distinctiveness, but over time, that's diminished because everything starts to look the same and it's mass-produced. So if we did have these certain parameters where you could go to this area and look at a house and like, oh, this house is different because it's got these gables and it's got a certain style of wood trim, as you move west, it really starts to become more difficult to discern what our folk traditional houses are because you can get timber and different materials all across the nation. Plus, people see an idea maybe that they like from New England. They combine it with the Mid-Atlantic, and they build their house in Texas using both of those things. The main thing is, again, folk housing was built with a house and materials, what was used for one family. Now, with U.S. popular housing, they mass-produce houses. You go into a neighborhood, I think of my own suburban neighborhood here in the Dallas area, and I see houses that look exactly the same as mine. Not all over the place, but my street, maybe on the house that looks like mine, and then a couple streets down, I see my exact house. Well, that's because they're mass-producing these houses so they can efficiently and cheaply build them and get as much profit as possible. Houses after World War II, which was 1945, they become more modern style houses. Since the 1960s, they call them neo-eclectic. Eclectic meaning from many different sources. So houses are built with many different traditions and sources. Looking specifically, here's the graph. And you can see, and it's kind of cool, where you have the ranch style houses, which were early on at the onset of World War II and up to 1975, which consequently is when I was born. Yes, so at the production of this podcast, I'm 40 years old because it's 2016, but I haven't had my birthday yet, which is September of 2016, so I'm about to be 41. In any case, and you can look through these houses here, 1940s, 1980s, you've got this contemporary style, it's more simplified, but as we move forward, we start to see the shed, and then people go back to the more traditional type houses, which you would have found on the East Coast, and they're pulling in things that make their house stand out, like you see these gables here, and the multiple windows that have their own roofs as well, and they go into neo-colonial and neo-Tudor. All we're looking for is the representation of folk housing in aspects of traditional housing. It's isolated and small. Popular culture is made for the masses. There, that's it. Key issue over. Okay, I guess we better dive in. Well, the situation is you got massive electronic diffusion of pop culture. It gets around the world very, very quickly. Popular culture diffuses rapidly around the world through electronic media. The obstacle to keep people from getting pop culture is just a lack of access. Perhaps they don't have television or they don't have internet access. And that's not even very common anymore. Most of the world has television and internet. And I've been in some pretty remote areas. And you're surprised who pulls out a cell phone with internet access on it and they can get on YouTube or Facebook or Twitter right there in the middle of the jungle. It's just insane these days. So if there's a new popular style or brand of shoe, it's going to get around the world really quickly, even to remote areas these days. So one of the things is the obstacle is lack of access. Like you can't get what's popular culture. But the other thing is money. So even if you're in the remote jungles, maybe they can't afford the new style of clothing. But it comes through these days pretty quickly. The things that spread pop culture, one of the biggest is TV, because it's the most popular leisure activity. People work, people go to school, but when they come home, they chill out in front of the TV, okay? Here's the deal. The average human watches 3.1 hours of TV every day. I mean, I didn't really think about that. You sit in front of the TV for 3 hours. Here's what's shocking. The average American watches 4.6 hours of TV per day. Wow, I did not realize that. That's almost 5 hours of sitting in front of the TV every single day. So here's Mr. Patterson's personal challenge. We've got to reduce that. Sure, it's fun to go home and relax. That's one of the greatest blessings. And it's good to get some news and things like that and just relax by watching your favorite show. But that's too much. Really. That's way too much. If we want to make positive change in this world, we've got to get away from the television set as Americans, okay? So let's make that commitment together. I can tell you just for me, this is just my personal input here. I don't even have television. I don't have cable. I don't have any of that stuff. I have TVs in my house, and I will watch movies that I rent or get off of like Amazon or YouTube or whatever, but I don't sit in front of the TV for 4.6 hours per day. Life is too awesome. There's too many things to do. I challenge you to do the same. In any case, TV, this is diffusing pop culture. In the early 20th century, which is when? That's in the 1900s, right? 20th century, so that's 1900s. So in the early 1900s, TV developed in multiple countries: United Kingdom, France, Germany, Japan, Soviet Union, and the United States. So these developed countries, they all have television that kind of developed at the same time. Then in the mid 20th century, the United States dominates with 80% of all 86% of all TVs. So the United States gets up and running. They have a whole bunch of TVs. The U.S. population is being inundated with television and everything that goes along with it. So we're in the lead. In the late 20th century, 1970s to 1999, TV is diffusing into Europe big time. Did I say that right? Yeah. Okay. So TV diffuses to Europe, pop culture is expanding there. And then in the early 21st century, which would be the 2000s, what we're seeing is near universal access across the globe. Everybody's got TV. So these days, we look at how Americans spend their weekends. And again, this is kind of sad. Like, it's cool that we have the blessing to be able to chill out and watch TV and relax, but half of our time is spent just sitting there watching TV. I mean, how much other things can we be doing and exploring and creating instead of just sitting there? Like, maybe we cut that in half and change it to 25%. But in any case, here's what we do. Reading 5%. Wow. That's not good. I mean, maybe we get lots of information these days on TV through like YouTube, or maybe we watch some historical YouTube, but whatever. Thinking and just relaxing, small amount there. Computer games, okay. Traveling and leisure, 10%. That seems pretty good. Hanging out, socializing, that's always good. But watching TV, how much time do we spend? That is so much as Americans. We want to get back to the status where we're able to influence and change the world in positive ways. Each of us sitting there individually watching TV for all that time, we've got to change that on our own. Diffusion of the internet. So we had television that diffused pop culture. We also got the internet. Internet diffuses like television, but at a much faster rate. Consider that in 1995, only 40 million internet users were worldwide. We had 25% of those, so we had over half here in the U.S. and 40 million worldwide. In 1995, I had just found out about internet. I think in 1992, I believe, I didn't even know what internet was. I had no idea. We had phones that plugged into the walls of our house by a wire, and that was it. We didn't have cell phones, no internet. And I graduated from high school in 1994. So in 1992, I remember my dad took me to his office for the first time, and he's like, let's look at colleges that you might want to go to. And I'm like, okay. He turns on his computer, and it went something like this. No joke. It was a weird sound that dial-up internet, because it had to dial into the phone to access the internet. And he pulled up this site, and it was a search site that doesn't exist anymore, but we searched for the first time about colleges. That was weird, and I remember that. And before that, we had to use like paper, like an encyclopedia, like a book where you look up colleges, where you go to the library to look up a physical book, where you had to go visit the college. That was the first time I even knew what internet was, and that was 1992. I know you don't care, but in any case, it's one for old people like me. In the year 2000, it goes from 40 million all the way up to 361 million. That's only in 5 years. Exponential growth there. So if the internet goes all the way across the world now, think how fast pop culture diffuses. French fries, McDonald's is advertising on the internet. Are you going to want to have some of your folk, traditional, wonderful, delicious, unique food, or are you going to want to have McDonald's? Well, maybe it depends on if you have the money and if you've been watching television that's diffused from the West here. Social media, not just the internet, but social media. This spreads information and trends in pop culture so fast, like instantaneously across the globe. The thing about these things is it begins in the United States and then it spreads rapidly. So the U.S. continues to dominate the content creation. So even though the globe has access to media content, the United States still dominates. We still create most of the content, meaning our culture is spreading across the globe more than anybody else. You see here in 2008, who's got Facebook? And 2011, at the time of the printing of this textbook by Rubenstein, look how many people are using Facebook now. Now, I know you kids these days, you don't even use Facebook that much anymore. You're using like Twitter and Snapchat and Instagram, and probably by the time you're reading this post, you don't use that anymore. But this is just an analogy of Facebook, how it blew up in just 3 years. And then we've got Twitter. So where we're using Twitter, still the United States is big, but it's going across the globe as well, and even into all of these countries. And then YouTube, the United States still leads, but it's diffused across the entire globe. So content, popular culture is being created in the United States, but it's going across the globe. Threats to folk culture. Well, how can we keep these unique traditions and culture and aspects of civilization that are different from what we find in the United States? Well, the problem is a lot of the media is controlled by developed countries like Japan, the United Kingdom, and the United States. These are the big three. What people are watching on TV in general all across the world is coming from Japan, the United Kingdom, and the United States, because they have the resources to create incredible capturing programs. If you're from the United States and you're a broadcast company, you're already set up. You've got media and flashy graphics and information, and you've got the financial resources. If you're from, I don't know, Peru, and you want to create your own TV station so your people can watch that, but you probably don't have that much money. So if you're a Peruvian citizen, what are you going to watch? Are you going to watch something from the United States, which has a lot of money and flashy graphics and people that are dressed in nice clothes? Or are you going to watch something from your local station that they're just kind of learning how to do and they don't have very much money and it kind of looks amateur and doesn't sound that great? I mean, it's only natural. What are you going to watch? So this becomes a problem, because if you want to maintain your folk culture in Peru, it becomes really difficult, especially with internet and television that diffuse pop culture into people's lives, because they tend to not want to do their folk culture anymore, because what they see on television says it's really cool and flashy and fun and popular to do pop culture. So what idea comes into people's mind is that, are we watching entertainment or is it cultural imperialism? You know what imperialism is? It's when, like the British, they went into other countries and they took over and they brought their way of life. So if we turn on the TV in Peru or in South Africa and we're watching Western content, media created from the United States or maybe even the United Kingdom, are we being entertained by watching their shows, or is it really a way of us being imperialized or having products such as Coca-Cola, Nike, McDonald's come into our country and take over? See, we think that there's this way that countries are standing out, but now more and more they're turning to pop culture because of television and internet. The problem is Western culture in television seems to glorify independence, violence with TV shows, sensuality, and consumerism, buying things. Well, folk culture doesn't necessarily follow any of these. Folk culture tends to follow family, tends to this goes back and forth because people do fight, but other cultures do have nonviolent traditions. Let's face it, in the United States, our television shows a lot of sensuality, and traditionally folk cultures, they are very minimalized and they keep things discreet or hidden. And then consumerism, that has become a value of pop culture, like buying things and creating jobs is important. Whereas in folk culture, more and more, we look into their traditions, and it's really about just their traditions and family. So when we talk about cultural imperialism, people from countries with a lot of folk culture, they sometimes worry that it's not just television and entertainment, it's a way of manipulating their culture. The other thought is the news. Is it fair news or is it biased? If you're getting news that's from major countries like Japan, US, or United Kingdom, well, then we're really only seeing news that reflects Western values. We really only are covering Western concerns. So developing countries, they just can't compete with the funding of major networks. So the news they end up seeing really is based from like the United States. So if you're watching that, then over time, your culture is adapting to the culture of the United States, the popular culture. So to cope with some of these threats, countries have attempted to do different things. One of the things they've tried to do is limit or block television. And you think about Soviet countries, the former Soviet Republic, or China's done it, North Korea does it, where they just block the television so their people can't be influenced by pop culture. They, of course, have tried to restrict internet use and maybe even restrict you going to certain sites. And they've tried to ban social media as a way of maintaining their control over folk culture or control in general. So, I mean, I see both sides. Like, Western culture is certainly an overwhelming influence, and I see the uniqueness of folk culture. So I can see the struggle with these things right here. And here's where we see countries that try to limit access to these 4 types of internet content. So here's the countries that are trying to block political content. Here's the countries that are trying to block social content. You think about in pop culture, we see gender equality much more than we would here in the Southwest Asian countries, where they try to maintain social inequality in a lot of aspects here. Conflict and security. Well, China doesn't want people seeing programs that deal with conflict and security. And internet tools, they're blocking creation tools in these countries in Southwest Asia because they want people to only follow what is known in these areas. So you see that on the one hand, television, internet, it's very powerful, but at the same time, it also has the power to influence traditional folk customs. Issue 4, we're looking at why do folk and pop culture face sustainability challenges. Sustainability challenges in folk culture. If you have increased connection with pop culture and you're trying to maintain the wonderful and unique traditions of your folk culture, that's going to be a problem because pop culture is created for the masses and it just kind of takes over people's culture. Let's look at 2 specific things here. The Amish, you have this Amish guy right here. And what they do is they kind of isolate themselves, and they are a traditional group. They avoid mechanical and electric power. They travel by horse, and they use hand tools. This is part of their folk culture. We look at their background. How they remained folk culture is they migrated from Europe to North America in search of low-cost land. And kind of the areas they found this at the time was Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Iowa. Their way of life diffuses very slowly through interregional migration within the United States after they moved over here. And this is not created for the masses. Like, a whole bunch of people are not wanting to live this folk culture way of life where they don't have electricity. So it's very isolated, and they keep it in small groups. Well, most recently, this folk culture has kind of had to transform a little bit by transplanting from Pennsylvania to Kentucky, where land is cheaper, because they have a tradition where when each son grows up, they provide them with land to farm. The issue was the land in Pennsylvania was becoming very expensive, and they couldn't afford it. So they had to move more southerly and westerly and find land that was affordable. So that was a challenge to sustaining their folk culture. We look at women's roles. Well, these have changed as well, because when we integrate pop culture, women go from staying at home and having children and cooking to getting an education and working in the workforce. If you've got women that have been staying home and that's part of your folk tradition, pop culture is overtaking that. Indian marriage. We've seen the increased demand for dowries, and these dowry disputes are creating adverse impacts on women. So dowries didn't even used to be in effect in India. And it was the British culture that came in and influenced them to create these dowries. And it's gone back and forth. You used to have to pay dowry to buy a bride. Then it switched over to where it's like, well, the bride's family really needs to pay a dowry to the groom as part of his way of taking care of her. And it's gone back and forth. But this folk tradition of the dowry has really increased the demand as the impact of pop culture increases the demand for supplies and consumerism. Sustainability challenges for pop culture. Well, what's the problem with pop culture and how is it impacting sustainability? Well, the first thing is pop culture creates uniform landscapes, pretty much where everything looks the same. The distribution of pop culture around the world tends to make places look the same because of product recognition, where you have logos that are everywhere. And here we are, this is the United States, where you see all of these logos. And Hardee's isn't necessarily in Texas, where we are, but some people watching this video probably know about Hardee's. But what you're seeing more and more in the United States and across the globe is Starbucks, McDonald's, Walmart, Target, Taco Bell, all across the landscape of the United States. So if you were to stand on the street corner right here and maybe you were blindfolded and somebody transported you around and then they took off your blindfold and you saw this, you'd be like, I don't know where I am because it all looks the same. Because you could be standing on a corner in Dallas to see this. You could be standing on a corner in Kansas City. You could be standing in a corner in New York State. Where are you? There's nothing unique about the place because it all looks like Walmart, Target, KFC, Starbucks. And it's starting to look like that across the globe too, where everything is uniform, everything looks the same. So that's a problem. Golf courses. This is just an example of pop culture. Well, pop culture of the Western pop culture likes to play golf. The problem is it really changes the environment because you flatten hills, you cut grass really short, you bring in sand, you drain, or you create new bodies of water. You use fertilizers and pesticides to create this landscape. And if we're thinking about sustainability, then you look down here and perhaps it's a problem because you have all this green area that used to be something else. It looks green, which we think is good, but at the same time, we're changing the landscape and we're cutting out this huge section of here for open fairways and golf greens. So this is Congressional County Club in Bethsaida, Maryland, and they made significant alterations to the landscape, and it takes up all of this area right here. So this is an aspect of pop culture. This certainly isn't used for individual families to farm on their own land, right? Pop culture also challenges environmental capacity because it generates a high volume of waste in the form of solids, liquids, and gases. You think about it. When you buy a product in the United States, you go to the store, it's packaged in things. Even if it's just a pen, think how small a pen is, like the size of maybe a little bit more than your finger. But what it's packaged in is much bigger than that. You've got this plastic clear packaging so you can see the pen, and then the big cardboard type, thin, but cardboard type wrapping in plastic packaging that goes all the way around it. And then what do you do when you buy the pen? You throw all that away. That's waste. When you go to McDonald's even, they give this big paper bag, lots of napkins, maybe a knife and fork and boxes for your food, and it's all for just like some French fries. And then all that is waste. That's pop culture. So we've got most of this pop culture environmental waste that's visible in solid in the creation of cans, bottles, cars, paper, and plastic. That all has to go somewhere. Some of it's recycled these days, but a lot of it goes into landfills. The more people adopt pop culture across the globe, the more waste we have. So as far as sustainability and our ability to be able to live on this planet, pop culture tends to be a big problem. One of the concerns is resource depletion. In pop culture, there's a large demand for animal products. In one form, it's because of things that they're buying for their clothing, because it endangers, over the course of history, specific animals like mink, lynx, jaguar, kangaroo, and whale. They've all been used over time to create clothing. These days, we have a lot more that we can create through synthetic fibers, but people still want popular items that are made from these animals. And if you're getting a bunch of money for whale, then you're going to have people across the globe that are starving. They're going to find a way to go out and get whale and kill it and sell it so they can make a profit. That's pop culture. Pop culture also uses a large supply of meat. You think about beef is the Western diet. Any fast food chain, what are we eating? Beef in the form of a hamburger, taco, even Chipotle. It's beef that we're eating for the most part. Pop culture uses a lot of beef. The problem is, it takes a lot of land to feed beef. And here's what I mean. So we have to have land to grow food for humans, but we also have to have land to have our animals live on. But then we also have to have land to grow crops to feed to the animals. So really it's 3 times as much when we have the Western diet to grow meat. Not only do we have the land that we have to grow our own food on, we also have to have land to have the animals on and land to grow food to feed the animals. So it's a big resource depletion. One of the things that we're doing to combat that is recycling. This reduces the amount of solid waste going into landfills and incinerators through 2 steps. If you don't know what an incinerator is, look it up on Google. Now to tell you, it's a place that burns trash. So it makes it a smaller volume. So recycling is done in 2 manners. First, you pick it up from the consumers, but again, that takes the consumer taking the time to put it into their recycling bin and put it out on the curb. Number 2, the step is they manufacture those used products back into other products like paper, plastic, glass, and aluminum. So over time, we have reduced the amount of solid waste going into landfills. The major portion that we've reduced is paper. Think of all the paper products that we just throw away. That's how huge it used to be. Now, after recycling, our solid waste is reduced from 250 million to 164 million. So that is getting much better. Recycling is certainly helping. And we look at the waste per capita here. Let's see if I remember what I was looking at when we put this graph in. Okay. So yes, this is good. So here's our waste that has been going up as our population increases over the years from 1960 to 2010. But the good thing is recycling has really caught up with that. So we're not putting too much more into landfills because thankfully we are recycling a lot more. That's our look at chapter 4 and key issue 4.